Hey guys, in today's video I'd love to hear your thoughts, so be sure to subscribe and leave a comment below. Story 1. My name is Sarah Walker, and I probably made the biggest mistake of my life last summer. It's the kind of mistake that replays in your head at 3 a.m. The kind that makes you check the locks on your doors even in broad daylight. It all started with a hiking trip in Redwood National Park. I know Redwood. Sounds peaceful, right? Towering trees, fresh air, nature, Instagram perfect. And it was beautiful, don't get me wrong. But beauty can be deceiving, like a pretty face hiding something rotten underneath. My best friend, Emily, had been bugging me for months to get out of the city. "You're working too hard, Sarah," she'd say over our usual Friday night takeout. "You need to breathe, to reconnect with nature, to find your zen." Emily was big on zen ever since her yoga retreat in Bali. I mostly just wanted to sleep for a week, but the idea of escaping my cramped apartment and endless spreadsheets was tempting. So, Redwood it was. We planned a 5-day backpacking trip, hitting some of the less traveled trails, aiming for real wilderness. Emily, ever the planner, mapped out our route, booked our permits months in advance. Apparently Redwood permits are like gold dust in the summer, and even bought us matching hiking backpacks. Mine was bright purple, hers is a sensible forest green. That pretty much sums up our personalities. We flew into San Francisco, rented a sturdy SUV's Emily's insistence safety first, and drove north. The drive itself was stunning, Highway 1 winding along the coast, the Pacific crashing against the cliffs. For a day, I almost forgot about deadlines and demanding clients. Almost. We reached the park entrance late afternoon, picked up our permits, and spent the night at a campground just inside the park boundary. The campground was bustling with families, RVs, and the smell of campfire smoke. It was a far cry from the solitude we were seeking, but it was a necessary stop before plunging into the real backcountry. The next morning we started our hike. The trail was initially well maintained, wide and mostly flat, winding through groves of redwood giants that seemed to touch the sky. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in dappled patterns, illuminating ferns and moss. It was breathtaking in a very glitchy, postcard kind of way. As we hiked deeper, the crowds thinned out, and the trail became narrower, more rugged. By midday, we were completely alone, surrounded by nothing but trees and the rustling of leaves. Exactly what we wanted. We set up camp near a small creek, the sound of the water a constant, soothing murmur. Emily, the outdoorsy one, expertly pitched the tent while I wrestled with the water filter. We ate dehydrated meals that tasted vaguely of chicken and vegetables, but after a day of hiking, even cardboard would have tasted gourmet. That first night was peaceful. We talked for hours, catching up on life, laughing about silly things. The forest was quiet, save for the gentle hooting of an owl in the distance. I actually felt that zen thing Emily was always talking about. Maybe this trip wouldn't be so bad after all, I thought, drifting off to sleep in my sleeping bag. It was the second day when things started to feel off. It started subtly. Just a feeling, a prickle at the back of my neck, like someone was watching us. I chalked it up to being in the wilderness, my city, dweller senses on high alert. But the feeling persisted throughout the day, growing stronger as we hiked further into the woods. The trail on the second day was different, less defined, more overgrown. The redwood giants were still there, majestic and imposing, but the undergrowth was thicker, darker. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to shift and writhe even when there was no breeze. We were aiming for a specific landmark Emily had marked on her map, a waterfall called Hidden Falls. It was supposed to be off the main trails, a secluded spot known only to experienced hikers. Perfect for escaping the crowds, less perfect for, well, anything else, as it turned out. Around midday, we stopped for lunch by a murky stream. The water was sluggish, almost stagnant, and the air hung heavy and damp. Even Emily, usually so cheerful, seemed subdued. She was quieter than usual, her brow furrowed as she studied the map. "Are you sure we're on the right trail?" I asked, unwrapping a granola bar. It tasted like sawdust and despair. She pointed to a faint line on the map, barely visible amongst the contour lines. "According to this, yeah, but it's not very well marked." "Not very well marked is an understatement," I muttered, glancing around. The trail had all but disappeared, swallowed by ferns and fallen logs. We were essentially bushwhacking, relying on Emily's GPS and a vague sense of direction. As we started hiking again, the feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. I could hear things rustling in the undergrowth that sounded too deliberate to be animals. Snaps of twigs that were too sharp, too close. Every shadow seemed to hold a shape, every sound seemed to carry a whisper. I kept turning around, scanning the trees behind us, but there was never anything there. Just more trees, more shadows, more unnerving silence punctuated by those unsettling noises. Did you hear that? I asked Emily, stopping abruptly. She frowned, tilting her head. Hear what? Just the birds? No. Before that, like footsteps. She listened for a moment, then shook her head. Sarah, you're being jumpy. It's just the forest. Relax. I tried to relax. I really did. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It was like a cold hand pressing against my spine, telling me we weren't alone, that something was out there. Just beyond the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. We hiked for another couple of hours, the trail becoming even more indistinct. The forest grew darker, the redwood trees so tall and dense they blocked out most of the remaining sunlight. It felt like twilight, even though it was only mid-afternoon. Then we heard it again. Footsteps. Clearer this time, closer. Definitely not animal footsteps. These were heavy, deliberate, the sound of boots crunching on leaves and twigs. And they were definitely following us. I grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her to a stop. Emily listened. Footsteps. Someone's behind us. This time she heard it too. Her eyes widened, a flicker of fear replacing her earlier dismissiveness. We stood there, frozen, listening. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then, a twig snapped, closer than before. Hello. Emily called out, her voice trembling slightly. Is anyone there? Silence. Only the rustling of leaves in the wind. But the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was stronger than ever. Okay, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Maybe it's just another hiker. Lust, maybe. I didn't believe it for a second, but I needed to say something, anything to break the suffocating tension. Maybe. Emily said, but she didn't sound convinced either. She pulled out her bear spray, fumbling with the safety clip. Just in case. We started hiking again, faster this time, our eyes darting nervously from shadow to shadow. The footsteps didn't resume, but the silence was somehow even more terrifying. It was like whatever was following us was playing with us, letting us know it was there, letting us feel the fear. Before what? I didn't want to think about it. We finally reached Hidden Falls late in the afternoon. Or what we thought was Hidden Falls. It wasn't the idyllic waterfall Emily had described from her guidebook. It was more of a trickle, really barely a waterfall at all, cascading down moss, covered rocks into a small, stagnant pool. The air around the falls was cold, damp, and smelled faintly of mildew and something else's something metallic like old blood. And then we saw it. Scrawled on a large, flat rock near the pool, in what looked like dried blood, was a single word, my knee. The word hung in the air, heavy and ominous, painted in dried blood on the cold rock. Many. It wasn't just the word itself, but the way it was written, thick and uneven, like it had been scrawled in a frenzy, or with something other than ink. The metallic smell around the falls suddenly made sickening sense. Emily gasped, stumbling back, her face paling further. Oh God, Sarah. I stared at the word, my blood turning to ice. This wasn't just a feeling anymore. This was real. Someone, something, had been here. And it wasn't friendly. We need to go, I said, my voice tight. No. Emily didn't argue. She was already backing away, her eyes wide and darting around the darkening forest. We turned and practically ran back the way we came, scrambling over fallen logs, pushing through thickets of ferns, desperate to put distance between ourselves and that waterfall, that word, that feeling. The footsteps started again almost immediately. This time there was no mistaking them. Heavy, relentless, closing in. And there was something else now, too. A sound, a low, guttural growl like an animal, but wrong. Too deep, too resonant to knowing. We didn't speak, didn't even look at each other. We just ran, our lungs burning, our legs aching, the sounds behind us growing louder, closer. The forest seemed to close in around us, the shadows deepening, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes. It was like the woods themselves were turning against us, pushing us, driving us deeper into whatever waited. We burst back onto the faint trail, or what we thought was the trail, and kept running blindly, desperately. I risked a glance back just for a second. Through the trees, I saw a flicker of movement, a dark shape, too tall, too upright to be an animal. And then a flash of something pale, something that glinted in the fading light. Teeth. I didn't need to see more. I just ran faster, Emily right behind me, her breath coming in ragged gasps. We ran until we couldn't run anymore, until our legs felt like lead and our lungs screamed for air. We collapsed against a giant redwood, gasping, our hearts hammering against our ribs. The sounds behind us had stopped. Silence again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not the peaceful silence of the deep woods, but a heavy, expectant silence like the air before a storm, or before something much, much worse. Well, we lost it. Emily wheezed, her face streaked with sweat and dirt. I shook my head, my gaze fixed on the trees around us. No, it's still there. I can feel it. And I could. That cold dread, that prickling sensation was still there, stronger than ever. It was like whatever was following us wasn't just behind us anymore. It was around us, closing in, circling us. We had to move. Staying still was death. But which way to go? We were lost, disoriented, and the trail, if it even was a trail anymore, had vanished completely. Map, I croaked, reaching for Emily's backpack. Where are we? Emily fumbled for the map, her hands shaking so badly she could barely unfold it. She pointed to a spot, her finger trembling. Here, I think, near Hidden Falls. No, I said, shaking my head again. We're further in, much further. The map was useless now. We were off trail, lost in the heart of the redwood wilderness, with something hunting us. Then we heard it, a voice. Soft, low, almost a whisper, carried on the wind. But it wasn't the wind, it was a voice, and it was speaking our names. Sarah! Emily. It wasn't just a voice, it was voices. Whispering, murmuring all around us, coming from the trees themselves, from the shadows, from the very air. Our names over and over like a dark, seductive chant. Sarah, come closer. Emily, we have something for you. Emily screamed a raw, terrified sound that was swallowed by the vastness of the forest. She grabbed my hand, her grip like a vise, her eyes wide with pure, unadulterated terror. We have to run, she choked out. We have to get out of here. And we ran again. We ran as we had never run before, adrenaline pumping through our veins, fear lending us a desperate, unnatural speed. We ran through the darkening woods, the whispering voices chasing us, the unseen presence closing in, the word meant and burned into our minds. We ran until we stumbled upon it, a clearing, a small, unexpected opening in the dense forest, bathed in the eerie, fading light of dusk. And in the center of the clearing, a cabin. It was old, dilapidated, half hidden by overgrown bushes and vines. The windows were dark, the door hanging crookedly on its hinges. But it was shelter. It was a place. Anything was better than being hunted in the open woods. We stumbled towards it, collapsing onto the porch, gasping for breath, our bodies trembling. The whispering voices seemed to fade slightly as we reached the cabin, as if the structure itself offered some kind of protection. Or maybe it was just a trick, a lure. Emily fumbled for the door handle, pulling it open. The door creaked inward, revealing a dark, musty interior. It smelled of damp wood and decay, but also something else. Something sweet, cloying, almost floral, like lilies and rot. We hesitated at the doorway, peering into the darkness. Hello, I called out, my voice barely a whisper. Is anyone there? Silence. Only the creaking of the wind in the trees and the frantic pounding of our own hearts. Slowly, cautiously, we stepped inside. And that's when we saw it. On a rough-hewn wooden table in the center of the single room, bathed in a shaft of dying sunlight filtering through a cracked window, was a vase. A simple earthenware vase. And in the vase, lilies. White lilies in full bloom, their petals pristine, their fragrance overpowering, impossibly vibrant in the decaying cabin. And nestled amongst the lilies, almost hidden, but glinting in the fading light, two Brightbull hiking backpacks, identical to mine and Emily's. Except these weren't ours. These were new, perfectly clean, untouched by dirt or mud or the forest, as if they had been placed there waiting. And then the whispering voices started again, louder this time, closer, right outside the cabin walls. But now, they weren't just whispering our names. Now, they were saying something else. Something that made the blood run cold in our veins, something that echoed the words scrawled in blood at Hidden Falls, something that told us, in no uncertain terms, that we were not escaping this forest. The voices whispered, in unison, a single, chilling word, laced with a sickening sweetness, like the scent of lilies and Rotwell Kami. Story 2, my name is Emily Carter, and I'm probably doing the dumbest thing I've ever done in my life. You know that feeling, right? When you're standing at the edge of something, knowing you should turn back, but curiosity, or maybe something darker, just pulls you forward. That's where I am right now, deep in Redwood National Park, and the sun's already starting to dip below those colossal trees, painting everything in these long, eerie shadows. I came here with my brother, Liam, and his best friend, Noel. Liam's always been the adventurous type, the kind of guy who reads survival manuals for fun and thinks robbing it is a vacation. No's just along for the ride, I guess. He's loyal to a fault, and if Liam says national park, Noah packs his bags. Me, I'm the reluctant tag along, the voice of reason that nobody ever listens to. I'm a history major, for crying out loud. My idea of adventure involves dusty archives, not bear encounters and getting lost in the wilderness. But Liam was insistent. He'd been obsessed with Redwood National Park ever since he saw some documentary about the ancient forests and the unsolved disappearances that apparently pepper its history. Think about it, M. He'd said, eyes gleam with that familiar manic energy. The giant trees, hidden trails, maybe even some unexplained phenomena. It'll be epic. Apic. That's Liam's favorite word when he's ignoring all common sense. So here we are. We hiked in about 5 miles today, deeper than I really wanted to go, and set up camp near a creek Liam found on the map. It's beautiful, I'll give him that. The redwoods are breathtaking, these towering giants that block out most of the sky. The air is thick with the smell of damp earth and pine, and there's this constant, hushed whisper of wind high up in the canopy. It's peaceful in a way, but also imposing. Like you're being watched by something ancient and indifferent. No's trying to start a fire, looking like he's wrestling a particularly stubborn bear. Lime's off somewhere already. Scouting ahead, he called it, probably looking for those unexplained phenomena he's so keen on finding. And I'm just sitting here on a fallen log, trying to ignore the growing knot of unease in my stomach. It started subtly. Just a feeling, really. Like the forest is a little too quiet, even for a forest. The usual bird chatter and squirrel scolding is muted, almost absent. And the shadows are getting longer, deeper, stretching out from the trees like grasping fingers. Then there was the sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rustling leaves and the crackling creek. A kind of low, rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint it, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I glanced over at Noah, who finally managed to coax a pathetic little flame to life. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He looked up brow-furrowed, suit smeared across his cheek. "Hear what?" "Just the creek eam." "No," I insisted. "That thumping sound, like a drum maybe." He listened for a moment, then shrugged. "Wind in the trees. Lots of weird sounds out here, Em." "Relax." He grinned, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. I think he heard it too. Liam still hasn't come back. The fire's sputtering, casting flickering shadows that dance and writhe on the redwood trunks. The thumping sound is still there, persistent, a little louder now, and definitely rhythmic, like something huge and slow is moving closer, and now I hear something else, faint but distinct, a whisper. Too low to make out words, but definitely a voice. And it sounds like it's coming from the trees themselves. This was a mistake. Coming here. A really, really big mistake. The whisper got clearer. Not words, not exactly, but impressions. Coldness. Hunger. And something else, something ancient and vast that felt like it was watching me from the shadows between the trees. It was in my head now, a chilling hum that vibrated in my bones, making my teeth ache. "Liam?" I called out, my voice sharper than I intended. It cracked in the still air, swallowed by the redwoods. Silence answered me, except for the persistent thump, 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 and the whispering that seemed to coil around my thoughts. No jumped, startled by my shout, and nearly kicked over the pathetic fire. Sparks scattered into the darkness like tiny, desperate stars. What is it?" he asked, his voice tight with a nervousness he was trying to hide. "Liam's been gone too long," I said, standing up. The unease had solidified into a cold dread. "And did you hear that just now, the whispering?" He frowned, listened intently. No, just the wind, Em. You're spooking yourself. But he was looking around now, his eyes darting nervously to the deepening shadows. He grabbed a thick branch from the wood pile, holding it like a weapon. No, with a weapon. That was how I knew he was scared. It's not the wind, no. It's voices. And that thumping sound is getting louder. I took a step away from the fire, peering into the woods. The shadows seemed to redden and shift, playing tricks on my eyes. Was that movement between the trees? Something tall and dark, just at the edge of my vision. Liam. I shouted again, louder this time, desperation creeping into my voice. Liam, answer me. This isn't funny. Only silence. And the whispers, closer now, calder. They seemed to brush against my skin like icy fingers. I could almost taste them, like the metallic tang of blood mixed with the earthy rot of decay. Noah was beside me now, his branch held high. Okay, M. Okay, maybe he just wandered off trail. We'll go find him. Stay together, though, and keep your voice down. He glanced nervously into the trees, his usual bravado completely gone. We grabbed our flashlights, the beams cutting weak swaths through the gathering gloom. Leaving the sputtering fire behind felt wrong, like abandoning the last vestige of warmth and safety in this increasingly hostile forest. But staying put, waiting for Liam in this growing silence that felt worse. We started walking, calling Liam's name softly, our voices swallowed by the dense woods. The thumping sound was definitely louder now, a slow, heavy rhythm that seemed to vibrate up through the ground into my feet. And the whispering, it was almost understandable now, just at the edge of comprehension. Like a language I'd almost known, something primal and ancient, just beyond the reach of my conscious mind. Then we saw it, a flicker of light deeper in the woods, off the trail. Liam. No whispered, hope flickering in his voice. We pushed through a thicket of ferns, branches snagging at our clothes, and stumbled into a small clearing and stopped dead. It wasn't Liam. It was a structure of some kind. Not a cabin, not exactly, more like a shrine. Built from twisted branches and woven vines, it formed a crude dome, just tall enough for a person to stand in. And inside, there was a light. A faint, pulsing glow that emanated from the center of the structure. It wasn't firelight or flashlight beam. It was something else. Something organic, luminous from within. And it cast long, dancing shadows that stretched and writhed on the surrounding trees, making the branches look like skeletal arms reaching out. The thumping sound was deafening here, right in the clearing. It seemed to come from the shrine itself, from the pulsing light within. And the whispers, they were a chorus now, a low, sibilant chanting that seemed to emanate from the very air around us. No gasped, stumbling back, his flashlight beam shaking wildly. What is that? I didn't answer. I was frozen, staring at the shrine, at the pulsing light, at the shadows that danced like living things. Fear, cold and paralyzing, gripped me. This wasn't just a feeling anymore. This was real. Something was terribly, terribly wrong in this forest. And then the light pulsed brighter, and the whispers coalesced, resolving themselves into something almost words. Not English, not any language I knew, but somehow I understood they were calling a name, my name. Emily. And from the darkness beyond the shrine, something started to move. Something tall and dark and impossibly ancient. Coming closer. My flashlight beam shook, dancing across the twisted branches of the shrine. The pulsing light within intensified, throbbing like a diseased heart. And from the darkness beyond, it came. It was tall, impossibly so, its form shifting and indistinct in the shadows. Not quite human, not quite animal, but something in between, something wrong. I could see glints of pale skin, stretched taut over sharp angles, and long, dark limbs that moved with a fluid, unnatural grace. Its head was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and hungry, fixed on me. The whispers intensified, becoming a chorus of voices, all murmuring my name, drawing me closer. Emily, Emily, it wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a pull, a physical force tugging at my mind, my soul. I wanted to step forward, to obey the call, to lose myself in the darkness. Noah grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh. Run, we have to get out of here. His voice was choked with terror, but his grip was firm, pulling me back from the edge of the clearing. Reason flickered back in my mind, battling against the seductive pull of the whispers. Run. Yes, that was right. Run. Survival instinct, raw and primal, kicked, and I stumbled back, Noah dragging me, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we scrambled away from the shrine. The thumping sound was a roar now, shaking the ground beneath our feet. Behind us, I could hear rustling, snapping branches, the sound of something large and fast moving through the undergrowth, pursuing us. We plunged back in the trees, blindly following the beam of Noah's flashlight, stumbling over roots and fallen logs. The whispers chased us, echoing in our ears, weaving themselves into our thoughts, trying to confuse us, to lure us back. "Emily, come back, we want you," I risked a glance back. Through the trees, I caught glimpses of it. Taller than any man, its form still shifting, but undeniably gaining on us. It moved with an impossible speed, weaving through the dense forest as if it were nothing. And the pulsing light from the shrine it was moving with it, bobbing and weaving through the trees like a malevolent lantern guiding its hunter. Faster, Noah, faster. I gasped, my lungs burning, my legs aching. Fear lent me a desperate speed. We had to get back to camp, back to the trail, back to anywhere but here. We burst back into our campsite, the pathetic fire now just embers glowing faintly in the darkness. Lane was still gone. Despair washed over me, cold and bitter. We were alone. The creek, Noah yelled, pointing towards the sound of rushing water. Water maybe can't cross water. It was a desperate hope, but it was all we had. We stumbled towards the creek, crashing through the undergrowth. The thumping was right behind us now, the whispers a deafening roar in my head. I could feel its presence close, so close like a cold hand reaching for my soul. We reached the creek bank, the water rushing over rocks in the darkness. Without hesitation, Noah plunged in, splashing through the icy water. I followed, the shock of the cold stealing my breath, numbing my legs. We stumbled across the creek, scrambling up the opposite bank, gasping for air, shivering in the cold night air. Behind us, the thumping stopped. The whispers faded, receding into distance. We collapsed on the muddy bank, chests heavy, hearts pounding. For a long moment, we just lay there, listening, waiting. Silence. Only the sound of the rushing creek and the wind sighing in the redwoods above. Slowly, cautiously, we got our feet. The pulsing light was gone. The shrine was silent, dark, swallowed by the trees. Had we escaped, or was it just waiting? Liam No whispered, his voice hoarse. He looked back towards the woods, his face pale and drawn in the flashlight beam. We have to go back for him. I shook my head, a cold certainty settling in my stomach. No, Liam's gone. I knew it somehow. Felt it in the chilling silence that had fallen over the forest. Liam had gone looking for unexplained phenomena, and he'd found it. And it had taken him. We didn't stay in the park that night. We hiked out, stumbling through the darkness, driven by fear and exhaustion. We didn't speak, didn't look back. We just kept moving, putting as much distance as possible between ourselves and that clearing, that shrine, that thing in the woods. We reached the ranger station just before dawn, shivering, mud, cake and hollow-eyed. We told the ranger some story about getting lost, about Liam wandering off and not coming back. He looked at us with suspicion, but he called it in. Search and rescue teams would be sent out at first light, he said. But I knew. We both knew. They wouldn't find Liam. Not anymore. We left Redwood National Park that morning, the rising sun painting the sky in hues of pale gold and pink. It was beautiful, breathtakingly so. But all I could see was the darkness, the shadows stretching out from the trees, the pulsing light in the shrine, the tall, dark shape moving through the woods. And the whispers. Always the whispers. Back home, life went on. The search for Liam was eventually called off. Presumed lost in the wilderness, the official report said. No, and I tried to talk about it, about what we'd seen, what we'd heard. But the words felt hollow, inadequate. How could we explain something we didn't understand ourselves? How could we describe the cold dread, the ancient evil that lurked in the heart of that beautiful forest? We stopped talking about it eventually. No moved away to the other side of the country, seeking sunshine and open spaces, far from the shadows of the redwoods. I stayed, haunted by the memory, by the whispers that still echo in my dreams. Sometimes late at night, when the wind is just right, I think I can hear it. Faint rhythmic, just at the edge of hearing. Thump, thump, thump. And a whisper, carried on the wind, cold and hungry. Emily, I know it's still out there, waiting, in the shadows of the redwoods in the heart of the ancient forest. And sometimes, I wonder if it's still calling my name, if it will ever stop calling, if it will ever let me go. Story 3, my name is Alex Walker. I'm 28, and up until a week ago, my biggest worry was whether I'd finally finish my dissertation on time. Then my best friend, Chris, convinced me that a guy's weekend was essential for my mental health. Chris isn't persuasive. He's the kind of guy who sees essential as anything involving beer, nature, and preferably a slight hint of danger. So here we are at the trailhead of Redwood National Park in Northern California. It's early October, and the air has that crisp, pre-winter bite to it. Towering redwoods loom over us, their ancient branches filtering the sunlight into dappled shadows on the forest floor. Beautiful, sure, but also imposing, like you're stepping into a cathedral built by giants who really don't care if you're there or not. Besides Chris and me, there's also Sarah, Chris's girlfriend. I like Sarah. She's grounded and practical, a good counterpoint to Chris's more impulsive tendencies. She's a wildlife photographer, and honestly, I think she's the only one genuinely excited about the nature part of this trip. Chris is mostly in it for the beer and danger he keeps hinting at, and I'm just trying not to think about my looming dissertation deadline. All right, team. Chris clapped his hands together, startling a nearby squirrel. Let's conquer some wilderness. He grinned, adjusting his ridiculously oversized backpack. Chris always overpacks. I swear he's got a portable espresso machine in there somewhere. Sarah just rolled her eyes, but a small smile played on her lips. She checked her camera gear, her movements precise and efficient. Remember the plan, Chris. We stick to the designated trails. No exploring off path. Chris scoffed. Where's the fun in that? The real wilderness is off the beaten path, Sarah. That's where the adventure is. And beers, I added dryly, adjusting my own pack. I'm definitely the least outdoorsy of the group. My backpack is mostly filled with snacks and a first aid kit that I sincerely hope we won't need. Exactly, Chris exclaimed, completely missing my point. Potential bear encounters, now that's living. Sarah sighed again, but she shouldered her pack. Just promise me you'll be sensible, Chris. We're here to relax, remember, not end up on the evening news. Sensible is my middle name, Chris declared, puffing out his chest. His middle name is actually David, but arguing with Chris is usually a waste of breath. We started down the trail, the crunch of our boots on the fallen redwood needles, the only sound besides the rustling leaves high above. The air was cool and damp, and the scent of pine and earth filled my nostrils. It was undeniably beautiful, a world away from the city noise and stress I was used to. But as we walked deeper into the woods, a subtle unease started to creep in. It wasn't anything specific, just a feeling. The silence was almost too profound, the shadows too deep. Even the birds seemed to be keeping quiet. I glanced at Sarah. She was walking ahead, her camera held loosely in her hand, her gaze scanning the trees. She looked focused, but I thought I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a hint of apprehension. Chris, as usual, was oblivious, humming some off-key tune and occasionally pointing out interesting-looking fungi. He was in his element, completely unfazed by the growing stillness of the forest. You guys feeling this? I asked, breaking the silence. It's quiet, right? Sarah stopped and turned, her brow furrowed. Cuter than usual, yeah. And darker somehow, even for redwoods. Chris stopped humming. Darker is good, adds to the atmosphere, right? Spooky woods, maybe some cryptids. He grinned again, clearly still in adventure mode. Cryptids are not real, Chris, Sarah said patiently. And spooky is not necessarily good when we're miles from civilization. Relax, you too, Chris said, waving a dismissive hand. It's just nature being nature. Probably just a lull in the animal activity. Let's just enjoy the peace and quiet, okay? He started walking again, and Sarah and I exchanged a look. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just nature being nature. There was something else in the air, something waiting. And as we continued deeper into the silent, shadowed woods, I couldn't help but wonder if Chris's desire for danger was about to be fulfilled in a way none of us expected. The trail wound deeper into the redwood forest, the ancient trees growing taller and thicker, blocking out more and more of the already dim daylight. The fog, which had been a light mist at the trailhead, was now clinging to the forest floor in dense patches, swirling around our ankles like ghostly tendrils. It wasn't just quiet anymore, it was oppressively silent. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring and your senses strain for any sound, any break in the stillness. We hiked for another couple of hours, stopping only briefly for water and a quick energy bar. Sarah was still taking photos, but even her usual enthusiasm seemed muted. She was capturing the stark beauty of the redwoods, but I could see a growing unease in her eyes as she peered through the viewfinder. Chris, however, remained stubbornly upbeat, though even he had stopped humming. He was walking ahead, his usual boisterous energy replaced by a slightly forced cheerfulness. He kept pointing out interesting rock formations or oddly shaped trees, talking a little too loudly, as if trying to fill the void of silence around us. "See that root system," he said, gesturing to a massive redwood whose roots snaked across the trail like giant, petrified serpents. "Crazy how these things can live for thousands of years, right? Imagine what they've seen. Let's just hope they haven't seen anything we don't want to see." I muttered, more to myself than to him. Sarah shot me a look. "Don't start with the spooky stuff, Alex. You'll just encourage him." Chris grinned. "Spooky is good. Maybe we'll see a Bigfoot. Or those weird forest spirits the locals talk about." Sarah rolled her eyes again. "Chris, those are just legends, old wives' tales." "Maybe," Chris conceded. "But legends usually have a grain of truth, right? Maybe there's something unexplained out here in these woods." He trailed off, his voice losing some of its forced enthusiasm. Even Chris, it seemed, was starting to feel the weight of the forest silence, the subtle pressure of something unseen. As we rounded a bend in the trail, we came to a small clearing. A fallen redwood lay across the open space, its massive trunk slowly decaying, covered in moss and ferns. It looked like a natural bench, and we gratefully collapsed onto it for a proper rest. "Okay, 5 minutes," Sarah announced, setting her pack down. "Then we need to keep moving. We want to reach the designated campsite before dark." "Campsite," Chris groaned. "Boring. We should just camp out here under the stars. Real wilderness experience." "No stars tonight, Chris," Sarah said, pointing upwards. The fog was thickening, the sky above completely obscured by a gray, impenetrable blanket. And real wilderness experience sounds a lot less appealing when it's pitch black and we're surrounded by potential bears. Chris grumbled, but didn't argue further. He pulled out a can of beer from his pack. I wasn't kidding about the overpacking, and cracked it open with a satisfied sigh. I leaned back against the rough bark of the fallen redwood, trying to relax, but the silence was getting to me. I closed my eyes, trying to focus on the sounds of nature, but there were none, just silence. And then a sound that made my blood run cold. "Sarah." It was my voice, clear as day, but wrong. It was like my voice, but echoing, distorted, stretched out, and thin. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere deep within the woods, somewhere far away, yet somehow right next to me. My eyes snapped open. Sarah and Chris were both staring at me, their faces pale. Did you just say my name?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "No," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. "I didn't say anything. Did you hear that?" Chris's beer can slip his suddenly nerveless fingers and clattered onto the forest floor. He didn't take his eyes off me. "Yeah," he breathed. "Yeah, I heard it. Sounded like you, Alex. But different." The silence descended again, heavier than before. We sat frozen on the fallen redwood, listening, straining our ears, every nerve ending screaming. The fog swirled around us, the shadows deepened, and the forest held its breath. Then it came again, fainter this time, even more distorted, but undeniably there. "Chris." Sarah's voice, echoing through the trees, warped and stretched, distant and yet close. Sarah gasped, clutching at Chris's arm. That was me." "But how?" Chris scrambled to his feet, his bravado completely gone. He was looking around wildly, his eyes wide with fear. "What the hell was that? Is someone messing with us?" I stood up too, my legs feeling shaky. "I don't know, but I don't like it." The echoing silence returned, broken only by our ragged breathing. The forest seemed to be listening, watching, waiting. And in that oppressive stillness, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that we were no longer alone on the trail. Something else was out there, something that could mimic our voices, something that was echoing us. And whatever it was getting closer. Panic tightened its icy grip around us. We huddled together on the fallen redwood, our eyes darting into the swirling fog, searching for any sign of movement, any clue to the source of those chilling echoes. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the frantic thumping of my own heart. Okay, think, Sarah said, her voice strained but trying to be rational. There has to be a logical explanation. Echoes, weird acoustics in the forest, maybe some kind of prankster. Her voice wavered on the last word, betraying her own disbelief. Chris shook his head, his face pale and sweaty despite the cold air. Prankster, miles out here, mimicking our voices perfectly. Come on, Sarah. He swallowed hard. This isn't normal, though. I know, Sarah said quickly, but we can't jump to conclusions. Maybe it's just the wind, playing tricks with sound like Ethan Cole said about the fog in his story. She was referencing the story you gave me as context, a clever way to tie it in. I wanted to believe her, desperately. But the rational part of my brain was screaming that this was anything but natural. The way the voices sounded, the chilling accuracy of the mimicry, it felt deliberate, malevolent. Wind doesn't mimic voices, Sarah, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. And wind doesn't call us by name. Another silence descended, broken only by the rustling of unseen leaves and the drip, drip, drip of condensation from the redwood branches. The fog seemed to press in closer, thicker, as if the forest itself was listening, waiting. Then it spoke again, closer this time, louder, and undeniably directed at us. Chris Beers, it was Chris's voice, but warped, distorted mocking. It sounded like Chris, but twisted into something wrong. It came from the fog to our left, just beyond the edge of the clearing. Chris jumped back as if burned, stumbling over the fallen log. What the? That was my voice. He spun around, his eyes wide with terror. Who's there? Show yourself. Only silence answered him. The fog remained thick and impenetrable, hiding whatever or whoever had spoken. Don't engage, Sarah said, her voice trembling. Just stay calm. Maybe if we ignore it, he'll go away. Ignore it. Chris's voice was rising, bordering on hysteria. It's mimicking us. It's calling us by name. How can we ignore that? We have to try, I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. Panicking isn't going to help. Let's just get to the campsite. Maybe it'll be safer there. It was a flimsy plan, driven more by desperation than logic, but it was all we had. We scrambled to our feet, grabbing our packs, our movements jerky and uncoordinated with fear. We started walking again, faster this time, our eyes constantly scanning the fog, our ears straining for any sound. The trail seemed to twist and turn, leading us deeper and deeper into the woods. The redwoods loomed like silent, watchful giants, their shadows stretching long and distorted in the fog. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent jolts of fear through us. And then the voices started again, not just echoes this time, but whispers. Faint at first, barely audible, but growing steadily louder as we walked. They seemed to surround us, coming from all directions, waving through the fog like disembodied threads. Alex's dissertation, Sarah camera, Chris beer danger. They were our voices, fragments of our earlier conversations, twisted and distorted, whispered with a chilling, mocking intimacy. It was like the forest itself was regurgitating our thoughts, our fears, our very identities back at us in a grotesque and terrifying parody. Sarah started to sob, her composure finally breaking. Make it stop, please, make it stop. She stumbled, nearly falling, her face buried in her hands. Chris put an arm around her, his own face pale and drawn, but his voice surprisingly steady. Hey, it's okay, Sarah. We'll get through this. We just need to stay together. Together won't help, I said, my voice flat, devoid of hope. He knows us. It's inside our heads. Being together just makes it easier for it to echo us. I didn't know what was what we were facing, but a terrifying certainty was growing in my mind. This wasn't just some natural phenomenon, some weird acoustic trick. This was something else. Something ancient, something malevolent, something that was toying with us, feeding on our fear, mimicking our very selves. And as the whispering voices grew louder, swirling around us in the ever-thickening fog, I knew that the danger Chris had been so eager to find was here, in the Redwood National Park, and it was far more terrifying than anything he could have ever imagined. We were no longer just hiking in the woods. We were being hunted by something that knew our names, our voices, our deepest fears. And it was closing in. We stumbled through the fog-choked woods, the whispers of our mimic voices echoing around us, driving us closer to the edge of madness. Sarah was weeping openly now. Chris was pale and silent, his bravado completely shattered. I was running on pure adrenaline and terror, my mind racing, trying to find some way out of this nightmare. The whispers intensified, morphing from disjointed phrases into coherent sentences, still in our voices, but laced with a chilling, mocking tone. Alex, you'll never finish a dissertation. Sarah, smile for the camera forever. Chris, adventure time never ends. It was like our deepest fears and insecurities were being weaponized against us, thrown back at us by something that knew us intimately, even though we had no idea what it was. Suddenly, the trees thinned and we burst into a clearing. It was small, circular, and eerily still, even quieter than the surrounding woods. Fallen branches and rotting logs were scattered around, as if a storm had raged here and then abruptly ceased. And in the very center of the clearing there was a pit, a deep, dark hole in the earth, ringed by loose soil and shadowed by the overhanging trees. A cold, full smell wafted up from it. A smell of damp earth and decay, something ancient and unclean. We stopped dead at the edge of the clearing, paralyzed by a primal fear. The whispering voices faded, replaced by an even more unsettling silence. The fog swirled around the pit, obscuring its depths, but the darkness emanating from it was palpable, a physical weight pressing down on us. What is that? Sarah choked out, her voice barely audible. She was pointing a trembling finger at the pit. Chris just stared, his eyes wide and unfocused, his mouth moving silently as if he was trying to speak but couldn't find the words. I felt a cold dread wash over me, a sickening certainty that we had stumbled into the heart of this nightmare. This picket felt like the source of everything, the origin of the whispers, the home of whatever was mimicking us. As if summoned by our fear, a figure emerged from the fog at the far side of the clearing. It was tall, vaguely human-shaped, but distorted wrong. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an impossible angle, and as it stepped closer into a patch of slightly thinner fog, I saw its face. It was my face. My face, but not quite. Like a reflection in a warped mirror, a grotesque imitation. The features were there, the shape of my nose, the set of my jaw, the color of my eyes, but twisted, stretched, subtly off. It was like looking at myself in a funhouse mirror, but the funhouse was a nightmare. The thing that wore my face smiled, a slow, unsettling grin that didn't reach its eyes. And then it spoke. Alex, said in my voice, but with that same chilling echo, that same wrongness we had heard before. Come closer. Don't be afraid. Sarah screamed, a raw, animal sound of pure terror. Chris stumbled back, tripping over a log and falling heavily to the ground. I stood frozen, my mind blank, my body refusing to obey my commands. It was like facing my own reflection, but my reflection had come alive, and it was a monster. The mimic, me, took another step forward, its jerky movements bringing it closer to the pit. The fog swirled around its feet, as if the pit itself was drawing it in. We just want to be friends, it said, its voice echoing in the clearing, mocking my own attempts at humor, my own nervous jokes. Join us, Alex. Become part of us. It gestured towards the pit with a long, unnaturally thin hand. And for the first time, I saw what was inside. At first, it just looked like a jumble of shadows, a deeper darkness within the darkness of the pit. But as my eyes adjusted, as the fog shifted slightly, I started to make out shapes. Shapes that made my stomach churn and my blood run cold. Bodies. Dozens of them, maybe more, piled haphazardly in the pit. Twisted limbs, contorted faces, staring eyes reflecting the faint light filtering through the fog. And as I looked closer, I realized something even more horrifying. They all looked like us, like me, like Sarah, like Chris. Grotesque, decaying copies of ourselves, piled on top of each other in a macabre mockery of humanity. Doppelgangers, discarded shells, left behind by whatever thing was wearing our faces now. Sarah was sobbing hysterically. Chris was still on the ground, frozen in terror. The mimic, me, was still smiling, still beckoning us towards the pit. Come on, it whispered, my voice laced with a seductive, chilling intimacy. It's time to become one with the woods. Something snapped inside me. The terror, the paralysis broke, replaced by a surge of adrenaline, a desperate primal urge to survive. I didn't think, I just reacted. I grabbed Sarah's arm, yanking her to her feet. Run. I screamed, my voice hoarse with fear. Run now. Don't look back. I didn't wait to see if they followed. I turned and fled, plunging back into the fog-choked woods, away from the clearing, away from the pit, away from the thing that wore my face. I ran blindly, stumbling through the undergrowth, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning, my heart pounding like a drum against my ribs. Behind me, I heard screams. Sarah's scream, high and piercing, cut short abruptly. Then Chris's, a choked, desperate cry that faded quickly into the silence. And then the louder. My laughter, echoing through the trees, twisted and mocking, filled with a chilling, inhuman glee. I didn't stop running. I ran until I collapsed, exhausted, terrified, alone. I don't know how long I ran, how far I got. I just ran until I couldn't run anymore. I woke up hours later, in the pre-dawn darkness, lying on the cold forest floor. The fog was still there, but thinner now, the first hints of gray light filtering through the trees. The whispers were gone. The laughter was gone. The silence was just silence again. I was alone. I don't know what happened to Sarah and Chris. I don't know if they're dead or worse. I don't know what that thing was, what it wanted, or why it mimicked us. I only know that I ran, and I survived, somehow. I made it out of the woods eventually, stumbled onto a park ranger trail, flagged down a passing hiker, got back to civilization. The rangers didn't believe my story, of course. They launched a search for Sarah and Chris, but they haven't found anything, just woods, empty traillands, and snowlands. I'm back home, back in the city, back in the noise and the bright lights, but it's not the same anymore. The silence of the redwoods is still in my head. The echoes of those mimic voices still haunt my dreams. And every time I look in the mirror, I see my face. But sometimes, just for a split second, I see something else flicker behind my eyes. Something wrong. Something waiting. And I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. That the woods are still calling. That the mimic is still out there, in the fog, waiting for me to come back. Waiting to echo me again, to claim me, to add my face to the pit in the clearing. And sometimes late at night when the city noises fade, and the silence creeps in, I swear I can hear whispers. Faint at first, barely audible, but growing steadily louder. Alex, come back to the woods. The fog is waiting, and I think it's waiting for me. Story 4, and my name is Ethan Hayes, and I'm probably not going to make it out of Redwood National Park. I know that sounds dramatic, like something you'd read in a cheesy horror flick. But trust me, after what I've seen, dramatic is an understatement. Maybe writing this down will help. Maybe someone will even find it. If you are reading this, please, just believe me. I came to Redwood for the quiet. City life in San Francisco had become a constant hum of anxiety since my divorce went through last year. My buddy, Chris McIntyre, thought a few days of backpacking in the ancient forest would do me good. Mac's always been the outdoorsy type, a former scout leader who could identify any plant or animal track you threw at him. Me, I was more of a Netflix and pizza kind of guy, but I figured, what the hell? Fresh air and towering trees couldn't hurt. We drove up from the city last Friday, the California coastline flashing by in a blur of sunshine and surf. By late afternoon, we were deep in redwood territory, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The park itself is breathtaking, honestly. Imagine trees so tall they seem to pierce the sky, their reddish bark glowing in the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. It's peaceful, majestic, the kind of place that makes you feel insignificant, but in a good way. We set up camp at a designated backcountry site called Whispering Pines. Mac had picked it out, saying it was a little off the beaten path, less crowded. He wasn't wrong. When we arrived, there wasn't another soul in sight. Just us, the towering redwoods, and the quiet, which was almost oppressive. The first day was idyllic, honestly. We hiked a few trails, marveling at the size of the trees, the ferns carpeting the forest floor, the sunlight painting patterns on the moss-covered bark. Mac, as usual, was in his element, pointing out banana slugs and Roosevelt elk tracks, telling me stories about the park's history. I even started to feel a little of that city tension melt away. That night, around the campfire, things started to feel different. It wasn't anything specific, just a shift in the atmosphere. The usual night sounds of the forest, crickets, owls, the rustle of leaves, seemed to fade away, leaving behind a profound silence. And then there was the wind. It wasn't a normal wind. It didn't rustle the leaves in the canopy above or make the branches sway. It was a ground-level wind, a cold, whispering draft that snaked through the undergrowth, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And it carried a sound of faint, almost subliminal murmur like voices. "Hear that?" I asked Mac, poking at the fire with a stick. He paused, tilting his head, his brow furrowed. "Yeah, wind's picking up." "No, not just the wind," I said, trying to articulate what I was hearing. "It's like whispering." Mac chuckled. "Whispering pines, man. Probably just the trees creaking." Maybe he was right. Redwoods are ancient, massive. They probably make all sorts of weird noises. But the feeling in my gut was uneasy. It wasn't the sound itself, but the way it seemed to penetrate. Like it wasn't just in the air, but inside my head. We turned in for the night, zipping ourselves into our sleeping bags in the small tent. The whispering wind persisted, circling the tent like something curious or hungry. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the rhythm of Mac's breathing beside me. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off to sleep. I woke up abruptly, heart pounding. The fire had died down to embers, casting long, dancing shadows in the darkness. Mac was still asleep, snoring softly. But the whispering wind was gone, replaced by something else. Absolute, suffocating silence. No crickets, no owls, no rustling leaves. Just nothing, and in that silence I heard it. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. A sob. It was a woman's sob, choked and broken, carried on the still night air. It was coming from deep in the woods, beyond the circle of our dying firelight. It sounded lost, and utterly, heartbreakingly alone. I nudged Mac awake. "Mac, wake up. Do you hear that?" He grumbled, rolling over. "Hear what? Go back to sleep, Ethan." "No, listen. Someone's crying." He finally sat up, rubbing his eyes. He listened for a moment, the silence pressing in around us. Then he frowned. "Yeah, I hear it. Sounds like someone's in trouble." And that's when the uneasy feeling turned into something colder, something sharper. Because even in the vastness of Redwood National Park, in the dead of night, that sob sounded impossibly close. And it was definitely coming from the whispering pines. Mac and I exchanged a look in the dim tent light. He was awake now, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a flicker of concern. Mac isn't easily spooked, so seeing him unsettled definitely ratcheted up my own anxiety. "Think someone's hurt," I whispered, my voice sounding too loud in the oppressive silence. He shrugged, pulling on his boots. "Could be. Lost hiker, maybe. Or animal in distress." He didn't sound convinced, and neither was I. That sob, it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. "We should check it out," I said, grabbing my own boots and fumbling for my headlamp. Even though every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to zip myself back into my sleeping bag and pretend I hadn't heard anything, I knew we couldn't just ignore it. What if someone was hurt? Mac nodded, already unzipping the tent. "All right, but we stick together, and we don't go too far." He grabbed his own headlamp and the hefty bear spray canister he always carried. I grabbed the small camping hatchet we use for firewood, feeling ridiculously equipped for whatever was out there. We stepped out of the tent into a darkness that felt almost solid. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, and the towering redwoods blocked out what little starlight might have filtered through. The silence was still unnerving, broken only by the frantic thumping of my own heart. And then the sob came again, closer this time, clearer. Angular, it was definitely a woman crying, a sound of pure, unadulterated grief. It seemed to be coming from the west, deeper into the woods, towards a part of the park Mac had warned me about, an area of old, growth forest that was notoriously difficult to navigate, even in daylight. "Jesus." Mac breathed, his voice tight. "That's closer." We switched on our headlamps, the beams cutting weak swaths through the darkness, illuminating only the immediate circle around us. The whispering pines themselves loomed like silent giants, their needles rustling faintly in that strange, ground, level wind that had returned. But the whispering was different now, overlaid with that heartbreaking sob. It was like the trees themselves were weeping. "Let's just take a look," Max said, though his voice lacked conviction. He pointed his headlamp in the direction of the sound and started walking, Cautiously, bear spray held ready. I followed close behind, the hatchet feeling flimsy and useless in my trembling hand. We moved slowly, picking our way through the tangled undergrowth, the beams of our headlamps jumping nervously across the ferns and fallen logs. The forest floor was uneven, treacherous, and every shadow seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering light. The air was heavy, damp, and that strange, cold wind seemed to swirl around us, tugging at our clothes, whispering in our ears. The sobbing grew louder as we moved deeper, drawing us further and further away from the campsite. It was a siren song of despair, pulling us into the heart of the woods. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something emerge from the darkness behind us, but there was only the blackness, the whispering wind, and the relentless sound of weeping. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a small clearing. The trees here were even taller, their canopies so dense they blotted out the sky completely. The air was colder, heavier, and the silence was almost deafening. And in the center of the clearing we saw it. Or rather, we didn't see it. There was nothing there. No person, no animal, just the bare earth of the clearing, surrounded by the silent, watchful redwoods. But the sobbing, it was louder than ever now, seeming to emanate from the very air itself. Who? Hello. Mac called out, his voice echoing strangely in the clearing. Is anyone there? Are you hurt? Silence, except for the sobbing, which continued unabated, as if mocking us. We stood there for a moment, headlamps sweeping the clearing, searching for something. Anything. But there was nothing to see, just the empty space, the towering trees, and the sound of someone weeping in the dark. This is weird, Mac said finally, lowering his bear spray. Maybe it's just decoying, playing tricks on us. I shook my head, my scalp prickling with unease. No, it's right here. But there's nothing here. He frowned, stepping further into the clearing, his headlamp beam dancing across the bare earth. Maybe it's an animal, some kind of bird call. Mac, that's not a bird, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. That's someone crying, and it sounds human. He stopped, his gaze fixed on something at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of our headlamps. Did you see that?
See what?
I asked. My heart leaping into my throat. Movement, he said, his voice barely audible. Something white. By those trees. I followed his gaze, straining my eyes in the darkness. And then I saw it too. A flicker of white, a fleeting glimpse of something pale moving between the massive trunks of the redwoods at the edge of the clearing. It was gone in an instant, swallowed by the shadows. But the sobbing had stopped, just like that. Cut off mid-sob, leaving behind an even more profound and unsettling silence. We stood there, frozen, headlamps fixed on the spot where we'd seen the movement. The whispering wind swirled around us, but now it didn't sound like weeping. It sounded expectant waiting. Mecca. I started, my voice trembling. I don't like this. Let's go back to camp. He nodded slowly, his eyes wide and dark in the flickering lamplight. Yeah, he whispered. Yeah, let's go. We turned and started to retrace our steps, moving faster now, almost running. The clearing seemed to press in on us, the trees looming like silent witnesses, the darkness closing in. We didn't speak, just hurried back through the tangled undergrowth, our breath coming in ragged gasps, the sound of our own footsteps echoing too loudly in the unnatural silence. We didn't hear the sob again, but we did hear the whispering wind, and now it sounded different again. Not weeping, not expectant. Now it sounded amused. And as we stumbled back towards the faint glow of our dying campfire, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in the whispering pines. That something was watching us from the darkness, something pale and white with a voice that could break your heart. And that whatever it was waiting for us to come back. We practically stumbled back into our campsite, the dying embers of the fire a welcome beacon in the oppressive darkness. We didn't stop running until we were right back in the circle of firelight, collapsing onto our camp chairs, panting and sweating despite the chill night air. What the hell was that? I gasped, my voice shaky. Mac just shook his head, his face pale and drawn in the firelight. He was usually so unflappable, but even he looked genuinely shaken. I don't know, he whispered, his eyes darting nervously towards the woods. I don't know what the hell that was. We sat there in silence for a long time, just listening to the crackle of the rekindled fire and the whispering wind that still circled our camp, though now it seemed fainter, almost distant. The sobbing was gone, replaced by an unnerving quiet that felt even more oppressive than before. Neither of us wanted to talk about what we'd seen, or rather, what we hadn't seen in that clearing. The white flicker, the disembodied sobbing, the feeling of being watched, it all defied any rational explanation. And that was the most terrifying part. Finally, Max stirred, reaching for the bear spray. Maybe we should pack up, he said, his voice hesitant. Just to move to another campsite. Closer to the ranger station. The idea was tempting, desperately so. To leave this place, to get back to civilization, to pretend none of this had ever happened. But something held me back. A morbid curiosity maybe, or maybe just a stubborn refusal to be driven out of the wilderness by what? A ghost hallucination. No, I said, surprising myself. No, we stay. We came here for a few days, we stay a few days. It sounded braver than I felt. Inside, I was trembling, every nerve ending screaming at me to run. Mac looked at me like I was crazy. Ethan, did you forget what we just saw? Heard. This isn't normal. This is bad. I know, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But running away isn't going to solve anything. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks, or some weird animal call. We were probably just spooked. Liar, liar, pants on fire. He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. Fine, he said finally. We stay. But we stay armed. And we don't go wandering off in the woods again. Deal. Deal, I agreed, grabbing the hatchet again, feeling its weight a little more comforting now. We banked up the fire, adding more wood until the flames roared higher, pushing back the encroaching darkness. We sat huddled around it for hours, talking in low voices about anything and everything except what had just happened, trying to pretend that everything was normal, that we were just two guys camping in the woods, telling stories around a campfire. But the silence kept creeping back in, punctuated by the whispering wind, and every shadow seemed to hold a hidden threat. Sleep was impossible. We just sat there, watching the fire, listening to the forest, waiting for something. Dawn finally broke, painting the eastern sky in streaks of pale pink and gray. The forest seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the canopy. The oppressive silence lifted, replaced by the familiar sounds of birdsong and rustling leaves. The whispering wind died down, becoming just a normal breeze. In the daylight, the woods seemed almost ordinary. The clearing we'd stumbled upon last night looked peaceful, bathed in morning sunlight, the trees casting long, benign shadows. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, this place had felt so menacing, so wrong. We ate a quick breakfast of granola bars and instant coffee, the lukewarm liquid doing little to warm the chill that still lingered in my bones. We packed up camp in tense silence, our movements jerky and hurried. Neither of us said it, but I knew we were both eager to leave Whispering Pines behind. As we were dismantling the tent, Max suddenly stopped, his gaze fixed on something at the edge of the campsite, near where we'd entered the woods last night. Ethan, he said, his voice low and urgent. Look. I followed his gaze, my heart sinking. There at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the circle of our campsite, was something white, partially hidden behind a thicket of ferns. It was hard to make out at first, but as we moved closer, the ferns rustling aside, the morning sunlight finally revealing it, I felt my blood run cold. It was a figure, tall, slender, draped in something pale and flowing, like a shroud. It was facing away from us, its back to the campsite, standing motionless at the edge of the woods, as if watching us. And even from this distance, I could see the long, dark hair cascading down its back, almost reaching the ground. The pale figure. The one we glimpsed in the clearing last night. It was here, in broad daylight, watching us. We froze, paralyzed, bear spray and hatchet forgotten in our hands. The forest around us seemed to hold its breath, the birdsong fading, the rustling leaves falling silent. Only the whispering wind remained, now a faint chilling murmur, like a sigh of anticipation. The figure remained motionless, silent, its back still turned to us. But somehow, I knew it was aware of us, that it had been waiting for us. And that whatever it wasn't going to let us leave Whispering Pines so easily. Time seemed to stretch and distort as we stood there, frozen, staring at the pale figure at the edge of the woods. The morning sunlight, which had seemed so reassuring just moments before, now felt weak and ineffective, barely penetrating the gloom that clung to the base of the redwoods. The figure remained motionless, a silent sentinel guarding the entrance to the deeper forest. It was impossibly still, not even the slightest sway of fabric in the gentle breeze. It was like a statue carved from moonlight and shadow, placed there to warn us, or perhaps to lure us further in. Mac finally broke the silence, his voice a strained whisper. What is that thing? I shook my head, my throat too tight to speak. My mind was racing, desperately trying to find a rational explanation but coming up empty. Animal? No, it was too humanoid, too deliberately posed. Person. Maybe, but who would stand like that, draped in white, silent and still as death itself? Maybe it's just a hiker. I stammered, the words sounding hollow even to my own ears. Someone playing a prank. Max snorted, his eyes fixed on the figure. A prank? Ethan, look at it. Does that look like a prank to you? He was right. There was nothing playful or lighthearted about the figure. It radiated an aura of coldness, of ancient sorrow, of something hungry. And the longer we stared, the more palpable that feeling became, a creeping dread that seemed to seep into our very bones. Suddenly, the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, it turned its head, just enough for us to see its profile. And even in the dappled sunlight, even from this distance, I could see it. The face. It was pale, impossibly pale, like bleached bone. The features were vaguely human, but distorted, elongated, stretched thin like wax left too long in the sun. And the eyes, they were black. Not just dark, but utterly, completely black, like empty sockets staring out from a skull. And they were fixed on us. A wave of nausea washed over me, cold and clammy. I stumbled back, bumping into Mac, who was also reeling, his face ashen. The figure just watched us, its black eyes burning into our souls, and then it moved again. This time, it didn't just turn its head. It took a step forward, gliding rather than walking, the pale fabric of its shreds swirling around it like mist. And as it moved, the whispering wind intensified, rising from a murmur to a low, mournful moan that seemed to vibrate in the air itself. Hinning cue the sob. It was back, closer now, stronger, laced with a chilling undercurrent of anticipation. It was coming from the figure, emanating from it like a soundless scream, a psychic shriek that resonated deep within our minds. Run, Mac hissed, grabbing my arm, his voice tight with terror. Ethan, run. Now, he didn't have to tell me twice. Whatever that thing was, whatever it wanted, I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the core that we needed to get away, and fast. We turned and bolted, scrambling back towards the campsite, adrenaline surging through our veins. We didn't look back, didn't dare to see if the figure was following. We just ran blindly, desperately, stumbling over roots and fallen logs, crashing through ferns and undergrowth, the sound of our own panic breathing echoing in our ears. We reached the campsite, the familiar clearing a sudden heaven of normalcy in the encroaching nightmare. We didn't stop, just grabbed our packs, throwing everything haphazardly inside, ignoring the carefully organized gear, the meticulously folded clothes. Survival was the only thing that mattered now. As we were stuffing the last of our gear into our packs, I risked a glance back towards the woods. And there it was, the pale figure. Closer now, standing just at the edge of the trees, watching us with those black, empty eyes. The sobbing was louder, almost deafening, and the whispering wind had become a howling gale, whipping around the clearing, swirling leaves and pine needles into a frenzy. It was coming for us. Go, go, go! Mac yelled, shoving his pack onto his back, his face a mask of terror. He grabbed my arm again, pulling me towards the trail, away from the campsite, away from the figure, away from the whispering pines. We ran, faster than I thought possible, pushing ourselves to the limits of exhaustion, our lungs burning, our legs atching, our minds screaming for us to stop, to rest, to give up. But we couldn't stop. We knew, instinctively, that if we stopped, it would catch us. We ran for what felt like hours, the trail twisting and turning, climbing and descending, the redwoods blurring into a green and brown tunnel around us. The sobbing faded behind us, replaced by the relentless whispering wind, which seemed to follow us, urging us on, or perhaps herding us deeper into the forest. Finally, we stumbled out onto a wider trail, a marked path leading, hopefully, towards civilization. We collapsed onto a fallen log, gasping for breath, our bodies trembling, our minds reeling. We had put some distance between ourselves and whispering pines, but the feeling of dread still clung to us, a cold weight in our chests. Think we lost it. I panted, my voice barely audible. Max shook his head, his eyes still wide with fear. I don't know, he whispered. I don't think so. It felt like it was letting us go. His words chilled me even further. Letting us go. Why? What did that mean? As if in answer, the whispering wind intensified again, swirling around us, carrying a new sound, faint at first, but growing steadily louder. It was a new sob, different from the heartbroken weeping we'd heard before. This sob was triumphant, victorious, like something had just achieved a long-sought goal. And then we heard it, coming from the trail ahead of us, around a bend in the path, clear and unmistakable, carried on the wind. Hingang Hugh with the sobbing. It was ahead of us now, blocking our path. Waiting for us. We were trapped, whispering pines behind us, the pale figure waiting. And now ahead of us, the sobbing, blocking our escape. We were caught between them, surrounded with nowhere left to run. Mac and I exchanged a final, desperate look. We knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was it. That we weren't going to make it out of Redwood National Park. That the pale figure, the sobbing, the whispering pines, they had claimed us. And as the sobbing grew louder, closer, echoing through the ancient redwoods, I closed my eyes and waited for the darkness to claim me. Because in the whispering pines, silence is the only escape. And silence is coming. Story 5, my name is Ben, and my buddy Chris always says I have a knack for finding trouble. Maybe he's right. It's definitely true that I'm drawn to places most folks avoid, the kind of spots that feel like they're holding on to secrets, the air thick with something you can't quite name. That's probably why I talked Chris into this trip to Redwood National Park. It was supposed to be a classic guy's weekend. Just as the towering trees, and a break from the soul, crushing monotony of our office jobs back in Sacramento. Chris needed it especially. He'd been burning the candle at both ends, stressed about deadlines and his upcoming wedding to Sarah. Me, I just needed to breathe the air that didn't smell like recycled coffee and existential dread. We flew into San Francisco and rented a beat, UPS UV that smelled faintly of pine and regret. The drive north was classic California, winding coastal highways giving way to dense forests, the air getting crisper and cleaner mile by mile. By the time we reached the park entrance, the late afternoon sun was slanting through the redwoods, turning the forest floor into a cathedral of shadows and light. Man, Chris said, rolling down his window and taking a deep breath. I can already feel my blood pressure dropping. Just wait until we get to the campsite. I grinned, pulling out the map. I'd spent weeks researching, poring over park websites and hiking blogs to find the perfect, secluded spot. I'd settled on a backcountry site a few miles off the main trails, nestled near a tributary of Redwood Creek. Remote, peaceful, and supposedly primed for stargazing. We parked at the trailhead and shouldered our packs. Mine was probably pushing 50 pounds a tent, sleeping bag, enough dehydrated food to last us a week, and of course my trusty camera gear. Chris, ever the minimalist, traveled lighter, but he still grunted under the weight of his pack as we started down the trail. The initial part of the hike was easy. A well-maintained path wending through groves of ferns and under the colossal redwoods. Sunlight dappled through the canopy, painting shifting patterns on the trail. It was beautiful, undeniably majestic, the kind of place that makes you feel small and insignificant in the best possible way. But as we veered off the main trail onto the backcountry access path, the atmosphere shifted. The well-worn path narrowed, becoming overgrown in places. The sunlight seemed to dim, even though the sun was still relatively high. The air grew cooler, and the sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, the distant calls of birds seemed to fade, replaced by a heavy, almost oppressive silence. Getting a little quiet, huh? Chris said, his voice a little louder than necessary. Yeah, I replied, trying to sound casual, though I felt it too. An odd stillness had settled over the woods. It wasn't just quiet, it was expectant, like the forest was holding its breath. We hiked for another hour, the trail winding deeper into the woods. According to my map, we were close to the campsite. The tributary should be just ahead. I checked my compass, then glanced around, trying to get my bearings. That's when I saw it. Just off the trail, nestled between the roots of a giant redwood, was something that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just a discarded piece of gear, maybe a forgotten backpack. But as we got closer, I realized it was clothing. A pile of clothes neatly folded, sitting on a patch of moss. Who? Chris said, stopping beside me. Someone lose their laundry. I frowned, stepping closer. It was a strange assortment: jeans, a flannel shirt, a light jacket, even a pair of hiking boots, all meticulously folded, like someone had carefully undressed and left them there. And they weren't just any clothes. They looked old. Not just worn, but like they were from another era. The boots were heavy leather, the jeans thick denim, the flannel faded and soft. That's weird, I said, reaching out and touching the flannel. It felt strangely cold, even in the late afternoon sun. And then I noticed something else. There was no one around, no sign of a campsite, no footprints leading away from the clothes, nothing. Just this pile of old clothes, sitting silently in the middle of the vast, silent forest. A prickle of unease ran down my spine. This didn't feel like someone losing their laundry. This felt intentional, and deeply unsettlingly wrong. Ben, Chris said, his voice hesitant. Maybe we should keep moving. He was right. Whatever this was, it wasn't good. I took one last look at the strange pile of clothes, a cold knot forming in my stomach. Then I nodded to Chris, and we started walking again, the silence of the forest feeling heavier than ever. The image of those neatly folded clothes burned into my mind. We hiked another half-mile, maybe more, the unease from the clothes incident clinging to us like the damp forest air. Chris kept glancing back over his shoulder, and even I, the self-proclaimed seeker of strange places, felt a growing knot of dread in my gut. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the silence became. It was the kind of silence that felt like it was listening back. Finally, we reached the designated campsite. It was a small clearing, just big enough for a tent and a fire pit, nestled beside a creek that trickled over moss-covered stones. Normally, a spot like this would be idyllic, a perfect escape. But today, even the sound of the water seemed muted, swallowed by the surrounding trees. Well, Chris said, trying for a cheerful tone that didn't quite land. Home sweet home for the weekend. We set about the usual camp chores, unpacking, setting up the tent, gathering firewood. But even these mundane tasks felt different, charged with a nervous energy. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made us jump. Bandit, my usually fearless German shepherd, was acting strange too. He kept close to my side, tail tucked, ears constantly twitching, as if he was picking up on something we couldn't sense. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and deep orange, the forest around us seemed to darken unnaturally fast. The towering redwoods became looming silhouettes against the fading light, their branches like skeletal arms reaching out. The temperature dropped sharply, a cold that seeped into your bones despite the exertion of the hike. We got a fire going, the flames crackling and spitting, throwing flickering shadows against the trees. The fire helped a little, pushing back the encroaching darkness, but it couldn't dispel the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I glanced beyond the firelight, I expected to see eyes reflecting back, something unseen lurking just at the edge of our vision. Did you see anything else back there? Chris asked, poking at the fire with a stick. He was trying to sound casual, but his voice was tight. Besides the clothes, I said, pretending to misunderstand. Yeah, besides the laundry, he said, giving me a pointed look. Anything else so weird? I hesitated. I hadn't wanted to mention it, didn't want to feed the growing unease, but now, sitting in the deepening darkness, the silence pressing in, it felt wrong to keep it to myself. When we were getting off the main trail, I said slowly, I thought I saw something up ahead on the path. Just for a second, like movement. Chris's eyes widened. The firelight. Movement. What kind of movement? I don't know. I shrugged, trying to downplay it. Just a flicker, like something darted behind a tree. Probably just a deer or something, right? Chris said, but he didn't sound convinced. He stared into the flames, his brow furrowed. A deer wearing old-timey clothes. I chuckled humorlessly. Okay, yeah, the clothes were seriously weird, but the movement probably nothing. We fell silent again. The crackling fire the only sound for a long minute. Then Bandit suddenly growled, a low, rumbling sound deep in his chest. He was staring into the woods beyond the firelight, ears pricked, hackles raised. Bandit, what is it? I murmured, reaching out to put a hand on his back. His fur was stiff, tense. He didn't bark, didn't move, just kept staring into the darkness, a low growl vibrating in his throat. Chris and I both followed his gaze, peering into the blackness beyond the firelight, straining our eyes, listening intently. But there was nothing there. Just trees, shadows, and the oppressive silence of the redwood forest. Probably just a raccoon or something, I said, trying to reassure Chris and maybe myself. Lots of wildlife out here. But Bandit didn't relax. He remained tense, his growl slowly deepening, morphing into a low, guttural whine. And then we heard it. A sound from the woods. Not a rustle of leaves, not an animal call. Something else. It was faint at first, barely audible of the crackling fire, but it was definitely there. A soft, rhythmic thumping. Thump, thump, thump. It was slow, deliberate, and seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods, beyond the reach of the firelight. It wasn't loud, but it resonated in the silence, each thump sending a fresh wave of unease through me. Chris and I exchanged a look, our eyes wide in the flickering firelight. Bandit's whine escalated into a low bark, then another sharper, more insistent. The thumping continued, slow and steady, getting closer, or at least seeming to get closer. It was hard to tell in the echoing silence of the woods. What is that? Chris whispered, his voice barely audible. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. I don't know. The thumping grew a little louder, a little closer. Bandit was now barking frantically, lunging towards the darkness, straining at his leash. Chris scrambled back, closer to the fire, his eyes darting around wildly. I grabbed the flashlight, my hand shaking slightly, and pointed it into the woods, sweeping the beam through the trees, trying to pierce the oppressive darkness. Nothing. Just trees, shadows, and the dancing firelight. But the thumping was still there, closer now, undeniably closer. Thump, 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 and then overlaid on the thumping, we heard another sound. Faint, high-pitched, almost lost in the crackle of the fire and Bandit's frantic barking. A sound that made the blood run cold in my veins. A giggle, a soft, childish giggle, echoing from the darkness beyond the trees. And it was definitely, undeniably, getting closer. The giggle hung in the air, thin and chilling, slicing through the forest silence and the crackling fire. It was undeniably close now, just beyond the ring of firelight, and it was aiming at us. Chris recoiled, stumbling back against the tent, his face pale and slick with sweat. Bandit was losing it, barking in short, panicked bursts, pulling against his leash, desperate to flee into the opposite direction from where the sound was coming. What the hell was that? Chris stammered, his voice trembling. I don't know. I repeated, my own voice barely a whisper. But a cold dread was solidifying in my stomach. It wasn't an animal sound. It wasn't a natural sound. It was something else. Something deeply, fundamentally wrong. The thumping continued, steady and rhythmic, and the jiggling came again, closer this time, a little louder, laced with a disturbing, almost mocking quality. It was like something was playing with us. I swept the flashlight beam wildly through the trees again, my hand shaking so badly the light danced erratically across the darkness. Still nothing. Just trees, shadows, and the impenetrable blackness beyond. But the sounds were real, unmistakably real. Maybe it's kids. Chris suggested weakly, his voice laced with desperate hope. Maybe some kids messing around, hiking late, in the backcountry, a night, laughing night, like that. I said, the absurdity of the suggestion hanging heavy in the air. Even as I said it, I knew it was impossible. This was no childish prank. This was something far more sinister. The thumping was almost at the edge of the clearing now, just beyond the last ring of firelight. And the giggling was right there. I could almost feel it, a cold breath on the back of my neck, a mocking presence just out of sight. Suddenly, Bandit let out a heart-stopping yelp, a sound of pure terror, and lunged backwards, scrambling to get behind me, burying himself between my legs, trembling violently. He was whimpering now, a low, pathetic sound, his eyes wide with fear, fixed on something in the darkness. And then I saw it. Just at the edge of the firelight, where the shadows were deepest, something moved. A flicker, a shift in the darkness, too quick to properly register. But it was there. Something was there, just beyond the firelight, watching us. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The flashlight beam locked on the spot where I'd seen the movement. Chris gasped beside me, his hand gripping my arm so tightly his nails dug into my skin. The thumping stopped. The giggling ceased. The forest held its breath. Silence. A silence so profound it felt like it was pressing in on us, crushing us. The fire crackled, spitting sparks into the air, the only sound in the suffocating stillness. We stood there, frozen, hearts pounding, straining our eyes, waiting, dreading what would come next. And then it spoke. A voice soft, high-pitched, almost childlike, but with an undercurrent of something ancient and cruel. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, whispering on the edge of hearing, weaving through the shadows, slithering into our minds. "Hello." The voice whispered. It was my own voice, but twisted, warp-made, alien, and wrong. It was my voice, but not mine. It was like a distorted echo, a cruel imitation, a mockery of something familiar made monstrous. Chris gasped again, a choked, strangled sound. He stumbled back further, tripping over a root, falling heavily onto the ground, scrambling backwards on his hands and feet, away from the fire, away from the sound, his eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated terror. "No," he whimpered, shaking his head, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. "No, no, no." The voice spoke again, still soft, still high-pitched, still mine, but now laced with a chilling amusement. "Lost," whispered. Are you lost, Ben?" It knew my name. It knew me. And the way it said my name, it was like a caress, a promise, a threat all at once. It was intimate, invasive, violating. It felt like something was reaching into my mind, probing, searching, knowing. I stood frozen, paralyzed by fear, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand, fixed in the darkness. My own voice, twisted and wrong, echoing from the trees, calling my name. Bandit was whimpering between my legs. Chris was scrambling away in terror, and the fire crackled and spat, the only sound that felt real, that felt like it belonged to this world. And then the figure stepped out of the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, gaunt and skeletal, its limbs elongated and distorted, moving with a jerky, unnatural grace. It was vaguely humanoid, but wrong, so fundamentally wrong. Its skin was pale, stretched taut over sharp bones, and its limbs ended in long, spindly fingers tipped with black, claw-like nails. And then I saw its face, or what passed for a face. It was vaguely human shape, but stretched and pulled, like clay molded by a cruel and twisted hand. The skin was thin and translucent, stretched tight over the bone structure beneath. And where the eyes should have been, there were just holes. Empty sockets, black pits that seemed to swallow the firelight, that seemed to look through me, into something vast and cold and infinite beyond. But the mouth was the worst. It was too wide, stretching almost from ear to ear, a gaping maw filled with rows upon rows of needle-sharp teeth, too many teeth, too sharp, too wrong for any human mouth. And it was stretched into a grotesque, mocking smile, and then it spoke again, in my voice. "We've been waiting for you, Ben." But the words, spoken in my own voice by that monstrous figure, hung in the air, cold and heavy as death. It took a step closer, its elongated limbs moving with a disturbing, disjointed fluidity. The firelight flickered across its pale, stretched skin, highlighting the empty sockets where its eyes should have been, the grotesque, too wide smile filled with rows of needle teeth. Chris was still on the ground, whimpering, trying to crawl backwards. His eyes locked on the creature, his body rigid with terror. Bandit, somehow sensing the shift in threat, had stopped whimpering and was now growling again, a low, desperate snarl directed at the figure, despite his obvious fear. My mind was a whirlwind of ice and fire. Disbelief warred with stark, undeniable terror. This couldn't be real. This had to be a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. But the cold dread in my gut, the primal fear screaming in my veins, told me otherwise. This was real. This was happening. The creature took another step, closer to the firelight, closer to us. My flashlight beam wavered, dancing across its distorted form. It tilted its head, that grotesque smile widening, and spoke again, still in my voice, but now laced with a chilling anticipation. "You came all this way just for us." It raised a long, spindly hand, those black, claw-like nails clicking softly against each other. It was like a parody of a human gesture or grotesque invitation. And then it took another step, and another, moving slowly, deliberately, like a predator toying with its prey. Adrenaline finally jolted me out of my paralysis. Instinct, pure survival instinct, took over. I didn't think, didn't plan, didn't even consciously decide to move. My body just reacted. I shoved Bandit behind me, stepped in front of Chris, raised the flashlight like a weapon, and screamed. Not a word, not a coherent sound, just a raw, primal scream of fear and defiance ripped from the depths of my lungs. It echoed through the silent forest, a desperate cry against the encroaching darkness. The creature paused, its head tilting slightly, as if surprised by my outburst. The grotesque smile faltered for a fraction of a second, and in that fraction of a second, I acted. I dropped the flashlight, grabbed Chris by the arm, hauled him to his feet, and ran. I didn't look back, didn't hesitate. I just ran. I dragged Chris with me, stumbling through the firelight, plunging into the darkness, into the trees, into the waiting woods. Bandit, bless his loyal heart, was right behind us, barking furiously now, no longer whimpering, his fear replaced by a protective rage. We crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at our faces, roots tripping our feet, the darkness swallowing us whole. Behind us, I heard a sound. Not the thumping, not the giggling, something new. A low, guttural growl filled with frustration and hunger. And then the sound of pursuit. Not footsteps, not human strides. Something heavier, faster, moving through the woods with unnatural speed and power. We ran blindly, desperately, adrenaline pumping through our veins, fear lending us a speed we didn't know we possessed. I could hear Chris gasping for breath beside me, Bandit's frantic barking echoing through the trees behind us, and the terrifying sounds of pursuit closing in. I didn't know where we were going. Didn't have a plan, just ran away from the horror, away from the creature, away from the voice that sounded like mine. We stumbled through the darkness, weaving between the giant redwoods, scrambling over fallen logs, pushing through dense thickets of ferns, the forest floor a blur beneath our feet. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only minutes, I risked a glance back. Through the trees, through the darkness, I saw it. A flicker of pale movement, impossibly fast, weaving through the trees, gaining on us. And then I heard the voice again, closer now, laced with a chilling amusement. "Running, Ben. Where are you going?" Despair washed over me, cold and suffocating. It was too fast, too strong, too relentless. We couldn't outrun it. We were trapped. We were going to die here, in this silent, haunted forest. And then I saw it. Ahead through the trees, a faint glimmer of light. Not firelight, not moonlight. Something artificial. A weak flickering glow cutting through the darkness. Hope flared in my chest, a tiny spark in the overwhelming despair. Light. Civilization. Maybe we could make it. I grabbed Chris's arm, pulling him harder, pointing towards the light. "Thier." I gasped, my lungs burning, my voice ragged. "Light!" "Run!" We pushed ourselves harder, driven by a desperate surge of adrenaline, ignoring the burning in our lungs, the atching in our muscles, the terror clawing at our minds. The light grew brighter, closer, resolving into a single, weak bulb hanging above a wooden structure. A building, a ranger station, a park office. I didn't care. It was hope. We burst out of the trees, stumbling into a small clearing, collapsing onto the dirt path leading to the building, gasping for breath, our bodies shaking, our hearts pounding like drums. The creature didn't follow. It stopped at the edge of the trees. Just within the shadows, its pale form barely visible in the darkness. It stood there, motionless, watching us, that grotesque smile still stretched across its face. And then it spoke one last time, its voice, my voice, echoing softly through the clearing, laced with a chilling promise. "We'll be waiting when you come back." Then it was gone. Melted back into the shadows, vanished into the trees, leaving only silence and the weak, flickering light of the ranger station. We didn't wait to see if it would reappear. We scrambled to our feet, stumbled towards the light, towards the building, towards any semblance of safety. We hammered on the door, desperate, frantic, until finally, a sleepy-eyed ranger opened it. Blinking in confusion in our disheveled, terrified forms, we were safe. For now. But even as we stumbled inside, collapsing onto chairs, the ranger staring at us with concern, the warmth of the building slowly seeping into our frozen bones. I knew with a chilling certainty that it wasn't over. We had escaped. But we had also been seen. We had been noticed. And in the silent, ancient depths of Redwood National Park, something was waiting for us to come back. Waiting in the shadows, with our faces, with our voices, with that grotesque, empty smile. and I knew with a cold bone, deep certainty that one day we would. One way or another, we would go back. Because some places, some secrets, some horrors, they don't let you go. They just wait and listen and whisper in your own voice from the darkness, promising to be there when you come back. Story 6, and my name is Alex Walker. Yeah, I know, about as generic American as you can get, but hey, it's my name. I'm a park ranger, been working in the national park system for almost 10 years now. I've seen my share of weird stuff, tourists doing dumb things, wildlife acting unpredictable, the occasional lost hiker who wandered off trail and thought they could just wing it back. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened last fall in Redwood National Park. Redwood. Just the name conjures up images, right? Towering trees scraping the sky, dappled sunlight filtering through ancient canopies, the smell of damp earth and pine needles. It's breathtaking, majestic, humbling, and usually peaceful. That's why I took the transfer here last year. After a messy breakup and a particularly stressful stint in Yosemite dealing with crowds and bears raiding campsites every other night, I needed peace. Redwood promised that in spades. For the most part, it delivered. My days were filled with routine patrols, trail maintenance, and answering the same questions from tourists about the height of the trees. Yes, they're tall, and if there are bears, yes, but mostly black bears, and they're usually more scared of you than you are of them. Evenings were quiet, spent in my small cabin nestled in a secluded corner of the park, just me and the rustling leaves and the distant murmur of the Pacific. But then October rolled around, and things started to shift. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. A growing unease in the air, a sense of being watched even when I was alone. The usual sounds of the forest seemed muted, somehow. The birdsong less cheerful. The wind through the redwoods a low, almost mournful sigh. The first concrete thing I noticed was the fog. Redwood is known for its fog, it's part of the magic. Clinging to the coast and drifting inland, creating this ethereal, almost otherworldly atmosphere. But this fog was different. It wasn't the usual wispy coastal fog that burned off by midday. This was thick, dense, almost oily in texture, and it hung around for days, sometimes weeks at a time. It felt heavy, pressing down on everything, muffling sound and light, and making the already towering redwoods seem even more imposing, more menacing in their shrouded silence. Then came the reports. At first, just whispers, muttered by hikers coming back from the deeper trails. Something's wrong out there, they'd say, eyes wide, voices hushed. The woods, they feel different. I chalked it up to the fog, the season, people's imaginations running wild in the vastness of the park. Tourists get spooked easily, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Hikers started coming back earlier than planned, cutting their trips short. They complained of feeling unwell, of headaches, nausea, a pervasive sense of dread. One group swore they heard music, faint and distorted, echoing from the depths of the forest, music that seemed to vibrate in their bones, they said. And then the disappearances started. First, a solo backpacker experienced, well-equipped, vanished without a trace. Then a couple out for a day hike simply didn't return. Search and rescue teams were deployed, of course. We combed the trails, the undergrowth, even brought in dogs and helicopters. Nothing. No sign, no clue, just gone. Vanished in the redwood fog. That's when the park started to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. And I, Alex Walker, park ranger, was right in the middle of it, with a growing knot of dread tightening in my stomach, and the unsettling feeling that whatever was happening in Redwood National Park was only just beginning. The official line from Park HU was increased bear activity, and unusually hazardous trail conditions due to the fog. They closed off several of the deeper trails, issued warnings to hikers, and brought in extra rangers for patrol. We were told to reassure visitors, to downplay the unease, to keep things calm. But you could feel the tension humming under the surface, thick as the fog itself. Everyone felt it, rangers and tourists alike. Something was wrong, and no amount of official reassurance could mask it. I started spending more time in the woods, ostensibly on patrol, but really I was searching. Searching for what I didn't know. A clue, a sign, anything that could explain the growing dread that was clinging to the park like the fog. I hiked the closed trails, ignoring the official warnings, pushing deeper into the redwood groves, listening, watching. The silence was the first thing that really got to me. Not just the absence of birdsong, but a deeper, more profound silence. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, like everything was listening, waiting. And then there was the humming. It started subtly, so faint I almost dismissed it as the wind in the trees, or maybe just my imagination playing tricks on me. But it grew slowly, insidiously, until it was a constant, low frequency thrumming that vibrated in the air, in the ground, in my very bones. It wasn't loud, not exactly, but it was there always, a persistent, unsettling drone that seemed to seep into your mind, making your teeth ache and your skin crawl. The music the hikers had reported, I started hearing that too. Faint, distorted melodies, carried on the fog, weaving in and out of the humming. It sounded like old music, scratchy and distant, like a warped record playing on a broken phonograph. Sometimes it was almost recognizable, snippets of tunes that felt vaguely familiar, then they'd twist and distort, becoming discordant and unsettling, before fading back into the fog. One afternoon, deep in a groove of ancient redwoods, I found something. Off-trail, tucked away in a small hollow, almost hidden by ferns, was a campsite, or what was left of one. A tattered tent, ripped and collapsed, lay half buried in the damp earth. Scattered around it were remnants of gear, a rusted camp stove, a smashed lantern, a water bottle, its plastic bleached white by the elements, and bones. Animal bones, mostly scattered and gnawed. But mixed in with them, I found something else. Smaller bones, more delicate, finger bones. Human finger bones. My stomach clenched. I knelt down, carefully sifting through the debris. There, half hidden under a clump of moss, was a small, leather-bound journal. Waterlogged and moldy, but still intact. I carefully picked it up, my fingers trembling. As I lifted it, something else caught my eye, glinting in the dim light filtering through the fog. A small silver locket lying half buried in the dirt. It was tarnished and dull, but still ornate, with intricate carvings on its surface. I shoved the locket into my pocket, my heart pounding, and carefully tucked the journal into my backpack. I knew with a sickening certainty that this was connected to the disappearances. This was more than just beers or bad trails. Something dark, something ancient was stirring in Redwood National Park, and I was starting to feel like I was walking right into its heart. And the humming was getting louder. Back at my cabin, the fog seemed to have followed me, swirling around the eaves and pressing against the windows like a suffocating blanket. Ranger cabins aren't exactly fortresses, just simple, sturdy structures meant to withstand the elements. Tonight, though, it felt flimsy, vulnerable, like it wouldn't offer much protection against whatever was out there. I spread the journal out on my rough, hewn wooden table, the cabin's single lamp casting a weak circle of light. The leather was soft and damp, almost disintegrating in places. The pages were swollen and stuck together, the ink blurred and faded. It was going to be a slow, painstaking process, but I had to try. Carefully, I started to separate the pages, peeling them apart like delicate membranes. Most were illegible, just smears of brown ink on pulpy paper. But some fragments remained, tantalizing glimpses into something. For folk thick and never seen like it, to silence, woods, our humming consonant in list and head, it atches a music beautiful than Bronxo the Oitrie, Cabinoi, Mustanky. The entries reach just keep closed laws. The entries reach Sanctuatch and Lockup protects most were disjointed. Frantic, written in a shaky hand that seemed to deteriorate as the journal progressed. The last few pages were almost entirely blank, just faint scratches and smudges, like the writer had lost the strength, or perhaps the will to continue. The name Cabin jumped out at me repeatedly. Was this journal from someone else who had sought refuge in the Laro cabin? And the locket, the entry about the locket protecting them, that sent a shiver down my spine. I pulled the silver locket from my pocket, turning it over in my hand. It was cold to the touch, even through my gloves. The carvings were intricate, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the lamplight. There was a tiny clasp on the side. Hesitantly, I tried to open it. It was stiff, rusted shut, but with a little pressure, it clicked open. Inside, nestled against the tarnished silver, was a single object. Not a picture, not a memento, but a piece of bone. Small, white, perfectly smooth like polished ivory. It was shaped like a fingernail. A human fingernail. My breath hitched in my throat. I slammed the locket shut, recoiling as if it had burned me. The humming outside seemed to intensify, vibrating through the cabin walls, making the lamp flicker. The wind picked up, rattling the windows, and the fog pressed in even closer, obscuring the world outside. Suddenly, a sound pierced through the humming and the wind music. Faint, distorted, but undeniably music. The same warp, scratchy melodies I'd heard in the woods, drifting on the fog, weaving in and out of the constant thrumming. It was closer now, much closer, seemingly right outside the cabin. I froze, every muscle tense, listening. The music swirled around the cabin, a ghostly waltz, then twisted into something discordant, unsettling, a broken, mournful tune that seemed to claw at my nerves. And then, a new sound joined the symphony of dread, a soft scratching at the door. Scratch, 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 slow, deliberate, insistent. Like something was outside, testing the door, wanting to get in. Ranger cabins don't have locks. Just a simple latch. My heart hammered against my ribs. I grabbed my flashlight, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped it. Scratchy, scratch, scratch. The sound was closer now, right at the door, accompanied by a low but sniffing sound. Like an animal, but not like any animal I knew. Slowly forcing myself to move, I crept towards the door, my flashlight beam trembling in my hand. Scratch, scratch. It was right on the other side. Whatever it was. Waiting with a surge of adrenaline, I yanked the door open, swinging the flashlight beam outwards into the swirling fog. Nothing, just the fog thick and white, swirling in the lamplight. The wind sighing through the redwoods. The humming still constant, still vibrating, and the music fainter now, drifting away into the fog. The scratching gone. I stood there for a long moment, heart pounding, breath ragged, scanning the fog shrouded clearing outside the cabin. Nothing. Just empty, silent fog. Except as I was about to close the door, my flashlight beam caught something on the porch, right in front of the cabin steps. Something small, white lying in the damp earth. I moved closer, my hand still shaking, and focused the light. It was a single white flower. A delicate, almost translucent bloom, unlike anything I'd ever seen in redwood before. And lying right next to it, almost touching the petals, was a single human fingernail. Perfectly white, polished, smooth. Identical to the one inside the locket. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just the woods playing tricks. This wasn't just my imagination. Something was out there. Something was watching. And it was leaving me gifts. Sleep was impossible that night. I barricaded the door with a heavy wooden chair, though I knew in my gut it wouldn't stop whatever was outside if it really wanted in. I sat huddled by the lamp, the silver locket clutched in my hand, the journal open on the table, the white flower and fingernail placed carefully beside it like macabre offerings. The humming was relentless, a constant vibration that seeped into my bones, and the music now, still fainter now, drifted on the fog, a ghostly lullaby that promised no comfort. Dawn finally broke, a pale, weak light that barely penetrated the oppressive fog. I hadn't slept, my nerves raw, my senses on high alert. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin. It felt exposed, vulnerable, like a cage rather than a sanctuary. I needed to get out to understand what was happening, even if it meant facing whatever was lurking in the woods. Armed with my radio, my sidearm, a park ranger's carry them for wildlife protection, but tonight it felt woefully inadequate, and a backpack filled with supplies, I stepped out into the fog. The air was cold, damp, and heavy with the pervasive humming. The silence was still there, that oppressive, listening silence, but now it felt expectant, like the forest was waiting. I decided to follow the music. It was the only clue I had, the only thread to pull in this terrifying tapestry of dread. I hiked deeper into the woods, pushing through the dense fog, the distorted melodies guiding me like a siren song. The redwoods loomed around me, their towering forms shrouded in mist, their silence amplifying the unsettling music and the constant hum. The ground began to slope downwards, leading me into a ravine, a natural amphitheater of ancient trees and shadow. The fog was even thicker here, swirling around my ankles like ghostly tendrils, obscuring the path ahead. The music grew louder, resonating in the hollow, vibrating off the redwood trunks, becoming almost deafening. And then I saw it. In the center of the ravine, in a small clearing bathed in an unnatural, pale light that seemed to emanate from the fog itself, stood the cabin. Not my ranger cabin, but another cabin, older, more dilapidated, its roof sagging, its windows dark and empty, the Laro cabin. It looked exactly as Tessa Holbrook described in her story, a place of rot and decay, a horror movie set piece sprung to life. But it wasn't just the cabin that made my blood run cold. It was what was around it, figures. Standing motionless in the fog-drenched clearing, surrounding the cabin in a silent, watchful circle. Humanoid figures, but wrong. Their forms were indistinct in the fog, but I could see they were tall, gaunt, their limbs elongated and unnatural. And their faces, or what I could see of their faces through the swirling mist, were pale, smooth, featureless, except for two dark, hollow pits where their eyes should be. They were humming, all of them. A low, resonant drone that blended with the pervasive humming of the forest, creating a chorus of dread that seemed to vibrate the very air. And from the cabin itself, the distorted music poured forth, a ghostly melody that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the darkness. I froze, hidden behind a massive redwood, my heart hammering, my breath caught in my throat. They hadn't seen me yet, but I knew, with a primal certainty, that they were aware of me, that they were waiting, that I had stumbled into something ancient, something evil, something that had been lurking in Redwood National Park long before it was a park, long before the redwoods themselves were young. Slowly, silently, I started to back away. My eyes fixed on the figures in the clearing, my body trembling with fear. I had to get out. I had to warn someone. This wasn't bears, this wasn't fog, this was something else entirely, something that defied explanation, something that consumed people and left only silence and dread in its wake. As I retreated, the music from the cabin intensified, rising to a crescendo, a discordant, shrieking melody that seemed to tear at my sanity. The humming grew louder, vibrating through the ground, through my body, until I felt like I was going to shatter. And then, through the fog, through the trees, I saw movement. One of the figures had turned, its featureless face swiveled in my direction, those hollow eye sockets seeming to fixate on me, even through the dense mist. It started to move, gliding forward with an unnatural, fluid motion, its gaunt limbs stretching and distorting in the fog. It had seen me. It was coming for me. I turned and ran. I ran as I had never run before, adrenaline surging through my veins, fear lending me a speed I didn't know I possessed. I plunged through the fog, stumbling over roots and fallen branches. The music and the humming chasing me, the image of that hollow, I'd figure burned into my mind. I didn't stop running until I burst out of the dense redwood groove and stumbled onto a familiar trail, the main park trail, thankfully still open. Tourists were there, hikers, oblivious to the horror I had just escaped, their voices echoing in the relative quiet of the outer woods. I didn't stop until I reached my cabin, slamming the door shut, bolting the flimsy latch, collapsing against the wall, gasping for breath. I was safe for now, but the hum in the humming was still there, faint but persistent, a constant reminder of what I had seen, what I had escaped. And the music, I could still hear it, faintly carried on the wind, a ghostly whisper in the fog. I radioed Park HQ, my voice trembling as I reported unusual activity in the restricted zone, requesting backup, requesting help. I didn't tell them everything, not yet. How could I explain? Hollow-eyed figures, haunted music, a cabin in the woods that seemed to be the epicenter of something ancient and evil. They'd think I'd lost my mind. But as I waited for backup to arrive, huddled in my cabin, the fog still swirling outside, the humming still vibrating through the walls, I knew one thing for sure. Redwood National Park was no longer a sanctuary. It was something else entirely, something hungry. And I had a terrifying feeling that whatever I had seen in that fog, shrouded ravine was not going to stay hidden for long. And that the silence, the listening silence of the redwoods, was just the prelude to something far, far worse. And I, Alex Walker, park ranger, was now caught in the middle of it, with a silver locket containing a human fingernail, a waterlogged journal filled with cryptic warnings, and the chilling knowledge that some places, some woods, truly do not want to be found. And once they find you, there may be no escape. Story 7, my name is Alex Ryder, and I've always been drawn to places where the pavement ends, city lights, noise, crowds. Give me silence, trees, and the kind of darkness where you can actually see the stars. That's why, when my buddy Chris suggested a backpacking trip through Redwood National Park, I was the first one to say yes. We needed to unplug, he said, get away from the digital grind. Honestly, I needed it more than he did. Work had been a pressure cooker. My apartment felt like a concrete box. and even my houseplants were starting to look stressed. So, last weekend, we packed our gear, loaded up Chris's beat Upsuber Forester, affectionately nicknamed the Green Goblin, and pointed it north. California redwood's been a bucket list item for me. Towering giants that have stood for centuries. Sign me up. We arrived at the Tall Trees Grove trailhead late on a Friday afternoon. The air was cool even for late summer, and thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. Sunlight filtered weakly through the dense canopy, casting long, eerie shadows that danced with the breeze. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a couple of other cars and a lone pickup truck that looked like it had seen better decades. "Looks like we've got the place to ourselves," Chris said, stretching as he got out of the car. He was always the optimist. Chris is Chris. Picture your typical surfer dude, even though we're miles from the ocean. Blonde hair perpetually sun-bleached, perpetually laid back, and perpetually hungry. He was already digging into a bag of trail mix before we even hoisted our packs. "Let's hope it stays that way," I replied, adjusting the straps of my backpack. There was something about the silence here that wasn't peaceful. Exactly. It was heavy. Oppressive, almost. Like the trees themselves were holding their breath. We started down the trail. The only sounds are our boots crunching on the soft duff and the rustle of leaves high above. The redwoods were even more immense up close. They weren't just tall, they were massive, their trunks like ancient wrinkled skin disappearing into the green twilight above. It was humbling, awe-inspiring, and a little unsettling. After about an hour of hiking, we reached the designated campsite. It was a small clearing nestled amongst a grove of particularly enormous trees. A fire ring, a picnic table weathered gray, and that was about it. Perfect. We set up camp in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from shared understanding and years of friendship. Chris wrestled the tent while I gathered firewood. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in hues of purple and deep orange visible only in fleeting glimpses through the canopy, a chill deeper than the evening air started to creep into my bones. "Fire time," Chris asked, finally victorious over the tent poles. "Definitely," I said, maybe a little too quickly. I needed the warmth not just from the wood, but from anything to push back against the encroaching feeling of unease. As the flames crackled to life, casting flickering light against the redwood giants, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't as alone as we thought. It wasn't a sound, not exactly, more like a presence. Something watching from the deepening shadows beyond the firelight. I glanced at Chris, but he was happily roasting marshmallows, oblivious as usual. Maybe it was just my city, fried nerves finally getting a taste of real wilderness. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something else entirely. The fire was doing its best, snapping and popping, throwing out heat and a comforting, woodsy smell. But the darkness around our little circle of light felt vast and ancient, swallowing everything beyond the reach of the flames. Chris, fueled by marshmallows and the boundless energy of someone who actually sleeps well in the wilderness, was recounting some epic surf session from last winter. I was nodding along, pretending to listen, but my senses were on high alert. That feeling of being watched, it was still there, prickling the back of my neck. It wasn't just the normal rustling of leaves or the occasional snap of a twig. This was different. It felt intentional, like eyes. And then, dude, this wave just barrels up, right? Like seriously massive. Chris was saying, gesturing wildly with a gooey marshmallow stick. "Right, massive," I echoed, my gaze drifting towards the tree line. The shadows seemed to deepen and shift, playing tricks on my eyes. Was that a flicker of movement? Just beyond the firelight where the redwoods stood like silent sentinels. "You okay, man? You're looking kinda spacey," Chris said, finally noticing my lack of engagement. "Yeah, just tired, I guess," I lied. No point in freaking him out. Chris was good in a crisis, but sometimes his optimism bordered on delusion. "Long drive yesterday." "True that," he conceded, popping another marshmallow into his mouth. "Hey, you want to check out the creek before it gets totally dark?" Thought I heard water. A creek sounded good. Something real, something tangible to focus on besides the creeping unease. "Sure," I said, maybe a little too eagerly. "Let's go." We grabbed our flashlights and ventured out of the campsite, leaving the fire to burn low. The darkness under the redwoods was intense, even with the flashlights cutting beams through the gloom. The air was colder away from the fire, and the silence was even more profound. It pressed in on you, muffling your own breath. We followed a faint game trail, pushing through ferns that brushed against our legs. The sound of water grew louder, a soft gurgling that was almost swallowed by the silence. Then we reached a small creek, barely more than a trickle, winding its way through the roots of the giant trees. Cool, Chris said, shining his flashlight around. Nice spot. It was pretty, I guess. Moonlight, what little there was of it, dappled through the leaves, making the water shimmer faintly. But even here, by the soothing sound of the creek, the feeling of being watched persisted. Stronger even, suddenly I heard it, a whisper. Faint, almost inaudible, carried on the barely there breeze. It sounded like a voice. I froze. Flashlight beam fixed on the opposite bank of the creek. Did you hear that? I whispered, my voice tight. Chris frowned, still shining his light around, seemingly oblivious. Hear what? Just the creek, man. No. Wait, listen. I held my breath, straining my ears. There was again a whisper, too low to make out words, but definitely there. And it sounded close. Too close. Dude, I don't hear anything, Chris said, a hint of impatience creeping into his voice. Maybe it's just the wind playing tricks. It's not the wind, I insisted, my heart starting to hammer. The whisper seemed to be coming from the trees themselves, a low murmur that resonated in my chest. It felt ancient, malevolent. Then the whisper changed. It sharpened. Became clearer, though still too quiet to understand. But this time, it wasn't just a sound, it felt directed at me. And then, for just a split second, I saw it. Movement. In the shadows, behind a massive redwood trunk. A flicker of pale something too quick to make out, but enough to send a jolt of pure ice through my veins. I grabbed Chris's arm, my grip tight. Let's go, I said, my voice barely a croak. No, back to the fire. Chris finally seemed to sense something was wrong. His easygoing demeanor vanished, replaced by a flicker of concern in his eyes. Whoa, okay, what's going on? Just trust me, I said, pulling him back towards the trail. I didn't wait for him to argue. Didn't try to explain. I just needed to get back to the fire, back to the small circle of light and perceived safety. We practically ran back to the campsite, stumbling over roots and branches in the darkness. The whispers seemed to follow us, growing fainter as we got closer to the fire, but still there. Lingering at the edge of hearing like a promise, or a threat. When we burst back into the campsite, the fire had dwindled, embers glowing red in the darkness. The feeling of being watched was still there, but different, sharper, more focused. And now, I wasn't just imagining it, I could feel it, like something was drawing closer. Chris was staring at me, his face pale in the flickering firelight. Alex. What the hell was that? I shook my head, trying to catch my breath, trying to find words to explain something I didn't understand myself. I don't know, I stammered. But we need to keep the fire going. And then maybe we should stay up for a while. Chris didn't argue. He just nodded, his eyes wide, and started frantically piling more wood onto the dying embers. As the flames roared back to life, pushing back the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, in the whispering grove, was still watching, and waiting. We sat there for what felt like hours, feeding the fire, listening to the crackle of the flames and the pounding of our own hearts. The whispers had faded, or maybe we just tuned them out, overwhelmed by a more immediate sense of dread. The feeling of being watched was almost palpable now, like a physical weight pressing down on the campsite. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through me. Chris, surprisingly, was holding it together. He was usually the goofy one, the one who laughed things off, but now he was all sharp angles and nervous energy, his eyes constantly darting into the shadows. He kept feeding wood to the fire with a jerky, almost frantic motion, as if the flames were the only thing holding back the darkness. Think it's animals? He finally asked, his voice low and tight, not quite meeting my eyes. I wish, I said, and the lie tasted like ash in my mouth. Animals didn't whisper. Animals didn't make you feel like you were being dissected by invisible eyes. Maybe it's just mountain lions or something. Curious. Chris snorted, a short, humorless sound. Mountain lions don't whisper, dude. And they definitely don't make you feel like that. He shivered, pulling his jacket tight around him despite the fire's heat. Silence descended again, thick and heavy. The firelight danced, painting the redwood trunks in grotesque, shifting shapes. Every shadow seemed to writhe and twist, taking on monstrous forms in the periphery of my vision. I kept expecting to see something emerge from the darkness, some hulking shape with glowing eyes, but there was nothing. Just the silence, the shadows, and that oppressive feeling of being watched. Then the sound started, not whispers this time. Something else. Faint at first, almost like the wind sighing through the trees, but deeper, more resonant. A low, mournful hum that vibrated in the ground beneath us, in the air around us, in our very bones. It started softly, barely audible, then grew steadily louder, filling the silence, drowning out the crackle of the fire. It wasn't a natural sound, not like wind or water or animal cries. It was unearthly, like something ancient and vast was awakening, stretching limbs that had been dormant for centuries. Hank, who had been lying nervously at my feet, whimpered and pressed closer, burying his head against my leg. Even Chris, usually so unflappable, looked genuinely terrified. His eyes were wide, fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight, his face pale and slick with sweat. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I shook my head, my own throat suddenly dry and constricted. I had no idea. Some primal instinct screamed to me to run, to flee back down the trail, back to the car, back to civilization, but my legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot by a fear so profound it was almost paralyzing. The humming intensified, growing louder and lower, resonating deep within my chest. The ground seemed to vibrate beneath us, and the air itself felt thick and heavy, charged with an unseen energy. The firelight flickered erratically, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and coalesce into shapes. Shapes that weren't quite trees, weren't quite animals, but something else. Something vaguely humanoid but distorted, elongated, impossibly thin. And then I saw them, or I thought I saw them. Glimpses, fleeting impressions at the edge of the firelight, tall, dark shapes moving between the trees, just beyond the reach of the flames. Too fast to focus on, too indistinct to make out clearly, but undeniably there. Eyes, I saw eyes. Pale, luminous points of light in the darkness, watching us from the shadows. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The humming reached a crescendo, a deep, resonant drone that seemed to shake the very air around us. And then, abruptly, it stopped. Silence descended again, but this time it was different. Not the heavy, watchful silence from before. This was expectant. Like something was waiting. The fire crackled, the embers glowed, and the shadows danced. But the eyes were still there. Watching. Waiting, and now I could hear them again, the whispers closer now. Clearer. And this time I could almost make out words. Faint, sibilant sounds carried on the still night air. Leave. The whisper seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, resonating in my head, in my chest, in the very air around us. Leave, this place is ours. The voice was cold, ancient, and utterly devoid of human warmth. It wasn't just a sound, it was a command. A warning. And staring into the impenetrable darkness beyond the firelight, at the countless pairs of pale, watching eyes, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that we were no longer welcome here, that we were trespassers in a place that belonged to something else, something old, something dark, and something very, very hungry. Leave, the whispers hissed again, closer this time, laced with a chilling impatience. The eyes in the dark seemed to move, to shift, drawing nearer to the edge of the firelight. I didn't need to be told twice. Adrenaline finally overrode the paralysis of fear. "Chris, we gotta go," I yelled, my voice hoarse, scrambled to my feet. "No, grab your pack." Chris didn't hesitate. He was already moving, shoving half-eaten marshmallows and scattered gear into his backpack with frantic energy. Hank, sensing the urgency, was up and pacing, whining softly, his fur bristling. We didn't bother to extinguish the fire. Didn't bother to pack the tent properly. Didn't bother with anything except survival. We just grabbed our packs, our flashlights, and ran. Ran blindly into the darkness, away from the campsite, back towards the trailhead, back towards the car, back towards any semblance of safety. The trail was barely visible in the dim moonlight filtering through the canopy, but we didn't dare use our flashlights, afraid of drawing attention, of becoming even more visible to whatever was watching us from the trees. We stumbled and tripped over roots and rocks, branches whipping at our faces, our breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest seemed to close in around us, the redwoods looming like silent, accusing giants. The whispers followed, not as loud as before, but persistent, like a chorus of unseen voices urging us on, pushing us further into the night, going somewhere. The whisper was right behind us, so close it felt like breath on my neck. I risked a glance over my shoulder, heart hammering against my ribs. Nothing, just trees, shadows, darkness. But the feeling of being hunted was overwhelming. Faster. I gasped, pulling Chris along, urging him forward. He was lagging behind, his usual surfer stamina failing him in the face of pure terror. Hank, bless him, was keeping pace, running silently at my side, his low growl a constant reassurance in the oppressive silence. We ran for what felt like an eternity, the whispers dogging our heels, the unseen eyes burning into our backs. The trail seemed to twist and turn, leading us deeper and deeper into the woods, mocking our attempts to escape. Panic clawed at my throat, threatened to choke me. Were we even going the right way? Was there even a way out? Then through the trees, I saw it. A faint glimmer of light, not firelight, but something paler, artificial. Hope surged through me, a desperate, fragile thing. Civilization, the parking lot, the car, the trailhead. I yelled, pointing, my voice cracking. We're almost there. Chris stumbled, almost fell, but rallied, pushing himself forward with a renewed burst of energy. We burst out of the trees and into the clearing, the parking lot bathed in the weak, merciful glow of the moon. The Green Goblin. Beautiful beat, up, glorious Green Goblin. It had never looked so good. We fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly it took an agonizingly long time to unlock the doors. We piled into the car, slamming the doors shut, locking them with trembling fingers. I jammed the key into the ignition, my hands slick with sweat and twisted. The engine sputtered, cuffed, and died. No, 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 I muttered, twisting the key again and again, pumping the gas pedal, willing the damn thing to start. Nothing. Just the sickening silence of a dead engine. Panic threatened to engulf me completely. We were trapped. Just feet from safety, but trapped. I could feel the eyes in the darkness, still watching, still waiting, drawing closer. Try again. Chris yelled, his voice high-pitched with fear. Come on, Green Goblin. You can do it. I took a deep breath, trying to force myself to be calm, to think. Flooded engine, maybe. I waited a moment, then tried again, turning the key slowly, gently. The engine turned over, coughed, sputtered, and then, with a roar that sounded like the most beautiful music I'd ever heard, it started. I slammed the gas pedal, tires spitting gravel, and we lurched out of the parking lot, back onto the access road, back towards the highway, back towards away. Away from the redwoods, away from the whispers, away from the eyes in the dark. I didn't stop driving until we were miles away from the park entrance, miles away from the towering trees and the oppressive silence. I drove until the gas gauge needle was practically kissing E, until my hands were cramping on the steering wheel, until the first pale streaks of dawn began to paint the eastern sky. Then, and only then, did I pull over, collapsing back against the seat, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion and lingering fear. Chris was slumped beside me, equally drained, his face pale and drawn. Hank finally seemed to relax, settling down in the back seat with a soft sigh. We sat there in silence, the only sound the gentle hum of the idling engine, the world slowly waking up around us. The sun rose, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, chasing away the darkness, at least for a while. What the hell was that? Chris finally whispered, breaking the silence. His voice was still shaky, laced with disbelief. I shook my head, running a hand through my sweat-soaked hair. I don't know, I said, honestly. I just don't know. We didn't talk about it much after that. Not really. We drove back to the city in a daze. 2 ghosts haunted by whispers and eyes in the dark. We canceled our backpacking trip. Canceled all future camping trips. Canceled, maybe, a part of ourselves that had once sought solace in the wild. I still see them sometimes in my dreams. The redwoods, the shadows, the eyes. And I still hear them in the quiet moments when the city noise fades away. The whispers, faint, sibilant, carried on the wind. Leave. And I know with a cold certainty that will never leave me, that we were lucky to escape. That we stumbled into something ancient and terrible in those woods. Something that didn't want us there. Something that watches. And sometimes late at night, When the city is quiet and the darkness presses in, I wonder if it's still watching, if it's still waiting, and if one day it will whisper again. And next time, will we be able to run? Story 8. My name is Alex Riley, and I've always been drawn to places where the pavement ends and the wild begins. City life in Chicago had started to feel like a pressure cooker, and the need to escape to breathe the real air had become overwhelming. That's how I found myself, along with a few friends, at Blackwood National Park in Montana last summer. It was supposed to be a week of unplugging, hiking, and maybe, if we were lucky, spotting some wildlife that wasn't just pigeons and squirrels. Blackwood isn't one of the big name parks, the kind plastered on postcards. It's sprawling and remote, known more to locals and serious hikers than tourists. The park ranger's website talked about unspoiled wilderness and challenging trails, which honestly was exactly what we were after. We were a small group: myself, my girlfriend Sarah, and our friends Ben and Chloe. Sarah, with her bright, perpetually optimistic spirit, was the one who'd actually found Blackwood. She's a history teacher, and she'd stumbled across some obscure article about the park's history, something about old logging camps and ghost towns swallowed by the forest. Naturally, her curiosity was piqued. She pictured us exploring forgotten trails and uncovering hidden stories. Sarah's enthusiasm is infectious, and even though I'm more of a relaxed by the lake kind of guy, I found myself getting excited too. Ben, Sarah's older brother, is the practical one. Ex-military, always prepared, and a little bit overprotective of Sarah. He's the kind of guy who packs enough gear for a month, long expedition even for a weekend trip. He was the one who meticulously planned our routes, checked the weather reports obsessively, and made sure we had bear spray and a satellite phone, just in case. He'd said with a serious nod. Ben's presence was reassuring, even if he sometimes came across as a bit intense. Chloe was the wild card of our group, an artist always lost in her own world of sketchbooks and headphones. She was quieter than the rest of us, observing everything with keen, artistic eyes. Chloe was drawn to the park for its scenery, for the raw, untamed beauty, as she put it. She planned to spend most of her time sketching and taking photos, capturing the park's atmosphere in her own way. Chloe was a bit of an enigma, but we all enjoyed her company. We arrived at the park on a Monday afternoon. The ranger station was small and almost deserted. The ranger, a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Ranger Miller, gave us a curt welcome and a handful of trail maps. She warned us about recent bear activity on the northern trails and advised us to stick to the marked paths. Her demeanor was unsettling. Not unfriendly exactly, but distant, almost wary, like she knew something we didn't and wasn't sure she should tell us. We set up camp at a designated site near a creek, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The forest was dense, the trees tall and ancient, blocking out most of the sunlight even in the late afternoon. It was beautiful undeniably, but there was a weight to the silence, a stillness that felt watchful. As dusk began to settle, Chloe, who had been sketching by the creek, came back to camp looking pale. "Did you see something?" Sarah asked, noticing her expression. Chloe shook her head slowly, her eyes wide. "No, but I heard something." "Like what?" Ben asked, instantly alert, reaching for the bear spray he kept clipped to his belt. Chloe hesitated, wrapping her arms around herself as if suddenly cold. "Whispering," she said, her voice barely above a whisper itself. "Just whispers in the trees, like someone talking, but I couldn't make out the words, and there was no one there." Sarah and Ben exchanged a look. I tried to dismiss it as the wind, or maybe just Chloe's imagination getting carried away in the quiet of the woods. But looking at her face, at the genuine unease in her eyes, a prickle of something cold and unsettling began to creep up my own spine. "The whispers in the pine as they were just the wind, right, Ben?" Yeah. Ever the pragmatist immediately started scanning the tree line with his flashlight. "Probably just animals," he said, though his voice lacked its usual guy cajo. "Could be the wind playing tricks with the trees too. Sound travels funny in the woods." Sarah, always trying to soothe the ruffled feathers, put a hand on Chloe's shoulder. "Maybe you just startled a deer or something, Han. It's getting dark, everything looks spookier at dusk." I wanted to believe them, I really did. But the way Chloe had described it, whispers, it didn't sound like any animal I knew. and the air itself felt different now, heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. We made a fire, the flames crackling and spitting against the encroaching darkness. The firelight pushed back the shadows a little, creating a small circle of comfort in the vast, indifferent woods. We ate a quick dinner of dehydrated meals, the usual campfire fare, but tonight it felt less like a fun camping meal and more like a ritual, a way to ward off the unease that was settling over us. As the night deepened, the forest sounds intensified. Owls hooted in the distance, branches creaked in the wind, and the creek gurgled and whispered over the stones. But beneath these normal sounds, I started to hear it too. A faint murmur, a sibilant rustling that wasn't the wind. It was like voices, just out of reach of hearing, like someone was whispering secrets just beyond the edge of the firelight. I glanced at Chloe. She was staring into the flames, her face pale and drawn, her eyes fixed and unfocused. Sarah was trying to engage her in conversation, asking about her sketches, but Chloe just gave monosyllabic answers, her gaze drifting back to the flickering fire. Ben, true to form, was on high alert. He kept circling the perimeter of our camp, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, pausing every few minutes to listen, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked like a soldier on patrol, and it didn't exactly make me feel relaxed. Later, as we sat huddled around the dying embers, the whispering seemed to grow stronger. It wasn't just in the trees anymore. It felt like it was coming from everywhere, from the ground beneath us, from the air itself. It was maddeningly indistinct, just a constant, low murmur, like a crowd of people talking in another room, their words just beyond comprehension. "Do you guys hear that?" I finally asked, tight, breaking the strained silence. Sarah stopped mid-sentence. Ben froze, his flashlight beam still, pointed into the woods. Chloe didn't react, still lost in her own world or perhaps lost in the whispers. "Hear what, Alex?" Sarah asked, her voice hesitant now, a flicker of worry in her eyes. "See the whispering," I said, feeling foolish even as I said it. "That sound Chloe heard earlier. It's still there." Ben lowered his flashlight slowly, his gaze sweeping over the trees. "I hear it," he said quietly, his voice grim. "Yet I hear it now." Sarah's eyes widened. She strained her ears, listening intently. After a moment, a slow realization dawned on her face. "Oh my God," she whispered. "I hear it too." The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks flying into the night sky. The whispering continued, a constant, insidious murmur that seemed to burrow into our minds, filling the silence with an unsettling, incomprehensible noise. It wasn't threatening, not exactly, but it was wrong. Deeply, profoundly wrong. It felt like the forest itself was alive, and it was trying to tell us something, something we weren't meant to hear. Ben broke the silence, his voice low and urgent. "Okay, new plan," he said, his military training kicking in. "We stay together. No one goes off alone, not even to pee. We keep the fire going all night. And first light, we pack up and head back to the ranger station." Sarah nodded quickly, her eyes darting around the circle of firelight, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. "Agreed," she said. "This place, it's giving me the creeps." I looked at Chloe. She was still staring into the fire, a faint smile playing on her lips. It was a strange smile, distant and unsettling, like she was hearing something we weren't, something that amused her, or perhaps welcomed her. "Chloe?" I asked, gently touching her arm. "Chloe, did you hear what Ben said? We're leaving in the morning." She blinked slowly, her eyes focusing on me, but they didn't seem to see me, not really. "The whispers," she murmured, her voice dreamy, almost trance-like. "They're getting louder, they want us to stay." A shiver ran down my spine, colder than the night air. "No, Chloe," I said, my voice firmer now. "We're leaving. We're all leaving. First light." She just smiled, that unsettling smile again, and turned back to the fire, lost once more in the whispering darkness. The fire crackled, the wind rustled the leaves, and the whispers, they seemed to grow just a little bit louder. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that leaving Blackwood National Park in the morning might not be as simple as Ben hoped. We were deeper in the Blackwood now, and something in the woods, something in the whispers, didn't want us to go. Sleep was a luxury none of us could afford that night. We took shifts watching the fire, each hour dragging by with agonizing slowness. The whispering never stopped. If anything, it intensified, weaving itself into the rustling leaves and crackling fire, becoming a constant oppressive presence. It felt like the forest itself was breathing, sighing, murmuring secrets we were never meant to know. Chloe remained in her trance-like state, occasionally muttering to herself snippets of phrases lost in the constant whisper of the woods. Sarah tried to stay strong, but I could see the fear in her eyes, the way she jumped at every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth. Ben was a statue of tension, his jaw clenched, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness beyond the firelight, his hand never straying far from the bare spray. My own nerves were stretched to their breaking point. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every sound seemed to carry a hidden meaning. The forest could seem beautiful and inviting just yesterday, now felt malevolent, watchful, like a predator circling its prey. Around 3 a.m., when my shift started, the fog rolled in. It crept through the trees like ghostly fingers, thick and white, swallowing the firelight and turning the world beyond our small circle into an impenetrable white void. The whispering seemed to amplify in the fog, echoing and swirling around us, making it impossible to pinpoint its source. It felt like the forest was closing in, suffocating us with its secrets. Bella, who had been unusually quiet and subdued since Chloe's episode, started to whine softly, pressing close to my side, her fur bristling. She kept staring into the fog, her ears twitching, as if she could see or hear something moving just beyond the veil of white. "Easy, girl," I murmured, stroking her head, trying to reassure both her and myself. But my heart was hammering against my ribs, and my hand was shaking. The fog, the whispers, Chloe's vacant smile, the ranger's unsettling demeanor, it all coalesced into a feeling of dread so profound it was almost physical. Something was terribly wrong in Blackwood National Park, and we were caught in its web. Suddenly, Bella stiffened, a low growl rumbling in her chest. She was staring intently into the fog, her body rigid, her hackles raised. I followed her gaze, my flashlight beam cutting weakly through the dense white, trying to pierce the fog. And then I saw it, a shape, moving in the fog, just at the edge of the firelight. Tall and distinct, vaguely human-shaped, but wrong. It shimmered in the fog like heat rising off asphalt, distorting the air around it. It was too far to make out any details, just a shifting, indistinct form. But the feeling it radiated was unmistakable, cold, ancient, and utterly malevolent. My breath hitched in my throat. I grabbed Ben, shaking him awake. "Wake up! Something's out there." He was instantly alert, his eyes snapping open, his hand going for the bare spray. Sarah and Chloe stirred, woken by the commotion. I pointed my flashlight into the fog, the beam trembling in my hand. "Thier," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "In the fog. Do you see it?" Ben squinted, his eyes narrowed, scanning the white void. "Yeah," he breathed, his voice low and dangerous. "Yeah, I see it." Sarah gasped, clutching my arm, her knuckles white. Chloe just stared, her vacant smile widening slightly, as if welcoming a long-awaited guest. The shape in the fog began to move, slowly, deliberately, stepping out of the swirling white and into the edge of the firelight. As it moved closer, the fog seemed to thin around it, revealing nothing, just empty space, swirling fog, and the rustling trees. The shape was gone, but the feeling remained. A cold, oppressive dread that settled over the camp like a shroud. Bella continued to growl, her eyes fixed on the empty space where the shape had been, as if she could still see it, even though it was gone. Ben stood up slowly, his bare spray held ready. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice tight with adrenaline. "I don't know," I stammered, my heart still pounding in my chest. But it was watching us. Sarah was trembling, her eyes wide with terror. "We have to leave," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No, we can't stay here another minute." Ben nodded, his face grim. "Agreed. Fog's probably going to lift at dawn. We pack up, we leave. No arguments." Even Chloe, finally shaken out of her trance, seemed to understand the urgency. Her vacant smile faded, replaced by a flicker of fear in her eyes. She nodded slowly, her gaze darting nervously into the fog. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. We kept the fire blazing, huddled together in its flickering light, constantly scanning the fog-shrouded woods, listening to the whispers that seemed to grow louder, more insistent, with every passing minute. We were being watched. We were being hunted. And I had the terrifying feeling that whatever was out there in the Blackwood, it wasn't going to let us leave so easily. Dawn broke with agonizing slowness, painting the fog-choked forest in shades of gray and pale yellow. The fog was starting to thin, reluctantly retreating like a defeated army, but the oppressive feeling remained, clinging to the air like dampness. The whispers were still there, though perhaps a little fainter now, as if even the forest itself was weary after the long night. We packed up camp in a tense, hurried silence, our movements jerky and uncoordinated with exhaustion and fear. Chloe was still pale and withdrawn, but seemed more lucid, thankfully. She moved like a puppet, responding to our instructions, but her eyes held a haunted, distant look, as if a part of her was still lost in the whispers. Ben took charge, barking out orders, his military efficiency battling against the creeping dread. He checked and double-checked our gear, his movements precise and automatic, a stark contrast to the chaotic fear churning inside me. Sarah helped Chloe, her usual cheerfulness replaced by a grim determination, her lips pressed into a thin line. As we loaded the last of the gear into the car, I glanced back at the campsite. It looked desolate and abandoned, a small scar in the vast wilderness. I had a terrible feeling we were leaving something behind, something more than just a fire pit and some footprints. We were leaving a piece of ourselves in Blackwood National Park, a piece the forest might decide to keep. We started hiking back along the trail, Ben leading the way, machete in hand, clearing fallen branches and overgrown bushes. The trail was even more treacherous in the aftermath of the rain and fog, slick with mud and littered with debris. Emily stumbled a few times, her ankle clearly still bothering her, slowing our progress. The forest was eerily silent now, the daytime sounds muted, as if holding its breath. The whispers were almost gone, reduced to a faint, subliminal murmur, but the feeling of being watched persisted, amplified by the oppressive silence. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made us jump, our nerves raw and exposed. We walked for what felt like hours, the trail winding endlessly through the dense trees, each turn looking exactly like the last. The ranger station felt miles away, a distant, almost mythical place. Doubts started to creep in. Were we even going in the right direction? Had we somehow gotten lost in the fog? Suddenly, Chloe stopped dead in her tracks, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes widening in terror. She pointed into the trees, her finger trembling. "Fear," she whispered, her voice choked with fear. "It's there again." We froze, our hearts leaping into our throats, and followed her gaze, and there it was. The shape in the fog, no longer indistinct, no longer shimmering. It was clearer now, horribly, terrifyingly clear. It was tall and gaunt, impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and distorted, like a grotesque parody of a human form. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched taut over sharp, jutting bones. Its face, I'll never forget its face. Hollow sockets where eyes should have been, a wide, gaping maw stretched into a silent scream, filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth. It was the Banshee. Marana, the thing from the legends, and it was real. It stood motionless, partially obscured by the trees, watching us with those empty sockets, radiating an aura of pure, unadulterated sorrow and rage. The whispers intensified, swirling around us, no longer indistinct, but coalescing into words, into voices, a chorus of anguish and despair. "Leave this place." The whisper seemed to say, echoing in our minds, not our ears. "This is ours." Ben reacted instantly. He roared, a primal scream of defiance and terror, and charged forward, bear spray raised, unleashing a cloud of orange mist towards the creature. "Get back, you monster," he yelled, his voice cracking. "Get away from us." The creature didn't flinch. It didn't even seem to notice the bear spray. It just stood there, motionless, its empty gaze fixed on us, the whispers growing louder, more frantic. Then, with impossible speed, it moved. It lunged out of the trees, its gaunt limbs unfolding, covering the ground in terrifying strides. It moved faster than anything humanly possible, faster than any animal I'd ever seen. It was upon us in seconds. Chaos erupted. Sarah screamed, pulling Chloe back, stumbling on the uneven ground. Ben kept spraying the bear spray, creating a cloud of orange mist around us, but it seemed to have no effect. The creature swiped at him with a long skeletal arm, and Ben staggered back, clutching his face, howling in pain. I grabbed Sarah and Chloe, pulling them deeper into the trees, trying to create distance, to find cover. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The forest was alive, and it was against us. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of sorrow and rage, filling my head, drowning out all other sounds. I glanced back. Ben was on the ground, struggling, the creature looming over him, its silent scream fixed on his face. Sarah was pulling Chloe, who had collapsed again, her eyes rolled back, her body limp. We were separated. We were losing. Then Bella, out of nowhere. Bella launched herself at the creature, a black streak of fur and fury. She snarled and snapped, biting at its legs, distracting it from Ben. The creature turned its empty gaze on Bella, its silent scream widening, and for a moment, just a moment, it hesitated. That moment was all Ben needed. He scrambled back, his face streaming with tears from the bear spray, but he was on his feet, moving. He grabbed Sarah and Chloe, shoving them forward, pushing them deeper to the woods, away from the creature, away from Bella. "Run!" He roared at me, his voice raw with pain and terror. "Alex, run! Get them out of here!" I hesitated, torn. Bella. But Bentley was right. Sarah and Chloe, they needed me. And Bella had bought us time. With a final, agonizing look at Bella, who was still bravely attacking the monstrous creature, I turned and ran, pushing Sarah and Chloe ahead of me, stumbling through the trees, blindly following Ben, running for our lives, running away from the whispers, running away from Blackwood, running away from the sound of Bella's desperate snarls fading behind us in the fog. We ran until we couldn't run anymore, until our lungs burned and our legs trembled, until the whispers faded behind us, replaced by the pounding of our own hearts and the ragged gasps of our breath. We ran until we burst out of the trees and onto the park road, collapsing onto the asphalt, gasping for air, tears streaming down our faces. We were out of the Blackwood. We were alive, but we were broken. Ben was blinded, at least temporarily, by the bear spray. Sarah was traumatized, her cheerful spirit shattered. Chloe was never the same. She remained withdrawn and haunted, forever listening to whispers only she could hear. And Bella didn't make it out. We went back for her, of course, as soon as we could, with park rangers and search teams. But there was no trace of her, no sign of the creature, just the silent, indifferent forest, and the faint, lingering whispers in the pines. Blackwood National Park is still there, sprawling and remote, unspoiled wilderness, as the website calls it. But I know the truth now. It's spoiled, it's tainted, it's claimed. And sometimes late at night, when the wind is just right, I can still hear them. The whispers in the pines. And I know with a chilling certainty that Blackwood is still waiting. Waiting for us to return, waiting to claim its own. Story 9, my name is Alex, and I'm what you'd call a weekend warrior. During the week, I'm stuck in a cubicle in downtown Chicago, crunching numbers for some faceless corporation. But come Friday afternoon, I'm itching to escape the concrete jungle. My usual fix is hiking, getting lost in nature, breathing fresh air, and feeling the dirt beneath my boots. It's the only thing that keeps me sane. This time, I decided to go big. Instead of my usual state park day trip, I booked a long weekend at Redwood National Park in California. I'd seen the pictures online, towering trees that scraped the sky, mist, shrouded trails, and a silence so deep you could hear your own heartbeat. It sounded like the perfect antidote to city life. I convinced my buddy Ben to tag along. Ben's more of a city guy than me, prefers his craft breweries to wilderness trails, but he's always up for an adventure, or at least he pretends to be. We flew into San Francisco, rented a beat-up SUV that smelled faintly of pine and old gym socks, and drove north. The drive itself was breathtaking. As we got closer to the park, the landscape transformed. The rolling hills gave way to dense forests, and the air grew cooler and crisper. When we finally entered Redwood National Park, it felt like stepping into another world. The trees were even more colossal in person, their ancient trunks disappearing into the canopy high above. Sunlight filtered through the leaves in dappled patterns, creating an ethereal, almost otherworldly atmosphere. We checked into a small, rustic cabin just outside the park's main visitor center. It was basic but clean, with a wood-burning stove and the scent of pine needles clinging to everything. After dropping off our gear, we decided to take a short hike before dusk. We chose the Lady Bird Johnson Grove Trail, a relatively easy loop recommended for first-timers. The trail was beautiful, peaceful, and yes, incredibly silent. The redwoods absorbed sound like giant sponges. It was a silence that was almost heavy. We walked for about an hour, mostly in comfortable quiet, occasionally pointing out particularly impressive trees or snapping photos. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that peeked through the redwood canopy, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere. The air seemed to grow colder, and the shadows lengthened and deepened, taking on sharper edges. The silence, which had been peaceful, now felt different. It wasn't just the absence of sound, but a feeling of being listened to, of something watching from the deepening shadows. Getting a little spooky, huh? Ben said, breaking the silence, his voice a little too loud in the stillness. He chuckled nervously. "Just the woods at dusk, man," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But even as I said it, I felt a prickle of unease at the back of my neck. It was more than just the usual woods at night feeling. There was something else, something watchful. We quickened our pace, eager to get back to the cabin and the comforting glow of the wood stove. As we rounded a bend in the trail, I caught a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, deep within the trees to our left. I stopped, peering into the shadows. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Ben squinted, following my gaze. "See what? Probably just a deer or something." "Maybe," I said, but I wasn't convinced. It hadn't felt like a deer. It felt darker. We stood there for a moment longer, straining our eyes, but saw nothing more. Shrugging it off as my imagination getting the better of me, we continued on, the feeling of unease lingering, a cold knot in my stomach. The silence of the redwood forest had taken on a new, unsettling dimension, and I had a feeling that the peace and quiet I'd come seeking might be the last thing I'd find in these ancient woods. We practically jogged the rest of the way back to the cabin, the feeling of being watched intensifying with every step. The cabin, when we finally reached it, felt like a sanctuary. Ben immediately busied himself with lighting the wood stove, the crackling fire a welcome sound in the oppressive silence. I double-checked the cabin door, making sure the latch was secure, even though I knew it was a flimsy barrier against whatever was making me feel so uneasy. "Maybe we should have brought bear spray," Ben said, poking at the logs in the stove with unnecessary force. "Bears aren't really what I'm worried about right now," I muttered, staring out the small window into the deepening twilight. The trees outside seemed to press closer to the cabin, their shadows stretching long and distorted in the fading light. "What do you mean?" Ben asked, finally turning around, a flicker of genuine concern in his eyes. I hesitated, not wanting to sound like a complete nutjob. "I don't know, man. Just did you feel it out there, like something was watching?" Ben frowned. "Yeah, a little woods are creepy at night, Alex. It's kind of the point, right? Being out in nature, away from everything." He was trying to rationalize it, I could tell, trying to downplay the weirdness. And honestly, a part of me wanted to believe him. "Maybe," I said again, but the feeling persisted. It wasn't just creepy woods vibes. This was different. We ate a quick dinner of trail mix and jerky, the fire casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. The silence outside was broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves, sounds that in any other woods would be normal, but here felt amplified, almost deliberate. After dinner, we sat in front of the fire trying to relax. Ben pulled out his phone, scrolling through social media, desperately trying to reconnect with the digital world we'd left behind. Of course, there was no signal. He sighed dramatically and tossed the phone onto the small wooden table with a clatter. "Well, that's useless," he grumbled. "Guess we're really off the grid." "Yeah," I said, my gaze still fixed on the window. "Really off the grid." Suddenly, a sound cut through the silence, making both of us jump. It was a scratching sound coming from the side of the cabin near the window I was staring at. A slow, deliberate scratching, like fingernails dragging across rough wood. Ben's eyes widened, and he instinctively moved closer to the fire, as if the flames could offer some kind of protection. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. I held my breath, listening intently. The scratching came again, closer this time, right by the window pane. It was accompanied by a soft, almost inaudible sigh, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the air itself. "I don't know," I whispered back, my heart pounding in my chest. "Stay here." I grabbed the flashlight from the table, my hand trembling slightly. Slowly, cautiously, I moved towards the window, my senses on high alert. The scratching stopped as I approached. I took a deep breath and peered out through the dusty glass. Nothing. Just the trees, their branches swaying gently in a non-existent breeze. Shadows everywhere playing tricks on my eyes. I strained my ears, listening for any sound, any sign of movement. Silence. Just the crackling fire behind me. See anything? Ben asked, his voice tight with tension. Nothing, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Must have been a branch or something. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't a branch. Branches don't sigh. I stood there for a moment longer, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing to see. Finally, I turned back to Ben, trying to force a reassuring smile. False alarm, I said, trying to sound casual, just the woods being woods. But the scratching started again as soon as I turned my back. This time it was louder, more insistent, and it was moving. It was circling the cabin slowly, deliberately, the scratching sound tracing a path around the wooden walls. And the sighing was closer now. Right outside the walls, a soft, mournful sound that seemed to seep into the very fabric of the cabin. Ben was staring at me, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. Okay? He whispered, his voice trembling. Okay? That's not a branch. The scratching continued its slow, relentless circle, the sighing growing louder, closer. It felt like something was outside, examining the cabin, testing its defenses. And waiting for us to come out, or maybe waiting to come in. The fire in the stove suddenly seemed very small, very fragile, against the growing darkness and the unsettling sounds that surrounded us. The silence of the redwood forest had been replaced by something far more sinister, and I had a terrible feeling that whatever was outside, scratching at the walls, was not going to leave us alone. The scratching intensified, morphing into a frantic scraping, as if something with sharp claws was trying to tear its way through the cabin walls. The sighing became a low, guttural moan, a sound that resonated deep in my chest, making my teeth ache. Ben and I huddled together in front of the fire, our eyes darting nervously between the boarded up windows and the flimsy wooden door. What is that thing? Ben choked out, his voice barely audible above the cacophony of scraping and moaning. I don't know, I whispered back, my throat dry with fear. But I don't think it's an animal. The sounds were too deliberate, too intelligent. And the sighing, that mournful, almost human sighing, it was deeply unsettling. I grabbed the poker from beside the stove, brandishing it like a weapon, a pathetic gesture, I knew, against whatever was out there. Ben, to his credit, grabbed a heavy cast iron skillet from the small kitchenette, holding it defensively in front of him. We were armed with a fireplace poker and a frying pan against whatever this was. It felt absurdly inadequate. The scraping stopped abruptly, leaving an unnerving silence in its wake, broken only by the crackling fire. We held our breath, listening, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for the next sound, the next attack. The silence stretched, becoming almost unbearable. Then the sighing started again, closer now, right outside the door. It was louder, more insistent, and this time I could almost make out words within the mournful sound. Whispered words, just at the edge of comprehension, like a voice trying to speak through a thick fog. Did you hear that? I whispered to Ben, my eyes wide. He nodded, his face ashen. Yev, it's talking. I think so, I said, my blood running cold, but can't make out what it's saying. We both strained our ears, trying to decipher the whispered words within the sighing moan. It was like trying to understand a language spoken in grief and despair, a language that resonated with something primal and deeply unsettling within my own soul. Suddenly, the door rattled violently, the flimsy latch straining against the force. We both jumped back, scrambling further away from the door, our makeshift weapons raised. The rattling stopped, replaced by heavy thud against the door, like something large and solid had slammed against it. It's trying to get in. Ben gasped, his voice cracking with fear. Hold the door, I yelled, adrenaline surging through me. I dropped the poker and threw my weight against the door, bracing myself against the flimsy wood. Ben joined me, pushing his shoulder against the door beside mine. We strained against the wood, our muscles screaming as heavy thuds continued to impact the door, each one threatening to splinter the wood and send the latch flying. Whatever was outside was strong, stronger than any animal I could imagine, and it was relentless. The thudding continued, punctuated by the mournful sighing, which now seemed to be directly outside the door, the whispered words clearer now, though still just beyond my grasp. What does it want? Ben yelled, his voice strained with exertion and terror. I don't know, I shouted back, my arms atching, my legs trembling. But we can't hold the door. Our bodies pressed against the flimsy wood as the assault continued. The cabin shook with each impact. The fire in the stove spitting sparks, the shadows dancing wildly on the walls. It felt like an eternity, but was probably only minutes, maybe less. Minutes that stretched into an eternity of fear and adrenaline. Then, as suddenly as it began, the attack stopped. The thudding ceased, the scraping faded. The mournful sighing, it was still there, but it was receding, moving away from the cabin, fading back into the woods. We stood there, panting, our bodies trembling, still pressed against the door, listening to the silence that descended once more. A different silence this time, a silence that felt empty, as if whatever had been outside had simply given up or moved on. Slowly, cautiously, we pulled away from the door, our eyes still fixed on the wooden panels, expecting another attack at any moment. But the silence held. Just the crackling fire and our ragged breathing. Is it gone? Ben whispered, his voice hoarse. I listened intently, straining my ears. Silence. Just the rustling of leaves in the distance, a normal, natural sound this time. Not the deliberate, unsettling rustling from before. I think so, I said, my voice still trembling slightly. I think it's gone. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't truly gone. Whatever it was, whatever had been outside our cabin, scratching at the walls and sighing at the door, it was still out there, in the redwood forest, lurking in the shadows. And I had a feeling, a cold, creeping certainty, that this was far from over. That we hadn't seen the last of whatever was haunting these woods. And that the night was still young. Dawn crept through the gaps in the boarded windows, painting the cabin interior in pale gray light. We were both still huddled in front of the dying embers of the fire, exhausted and trembling. The silence outside was unnervingly complete. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just a heavy, oppressive stillness that felt more threatening than peaceful. We need to get out of here. Ben croaked, his voice raspy from fear and disuse. He looked like hell, pale and drawn, with dark circles under his eyes. I probably looked just as bad. No kidding. I agreed, my muscles atching from the tension of the night. We leave now. First light, before it comes back. I didn't even want to name whatever had attacked us. Giving it a name felt like giving it more power. We didn't bother with breakfast, grabbed our packs. We just stuffing them haphazardly with the few remaining supplies. Every creak of the cabin floor, every rustle of leaves outside made us jump. The fear was a living thing now, coiling in our guts, tightening our chests. I cautiously unlatched the door, peering out into the pre-dawn gloom. The woods were shrouded in a thick, ground-hugging fog, making visibility near zero. The air was cold and damp, clinging to our skin like a shroud. It was the perfect setting for a horror movie, and we were definitely living in one. Fog's thick, I muttered, stepping out on the porch, poker still clutched in my hand. Ben followed, skillet held like a shield. We looked like a pair of ridiculous, terrified warriors. We moved slowly, cautiously away from the cabin, our senses on high alert. The fog muffled sound, making it impossible to tell if anything was nearby. Every shadow seemed to writhe and shift. Every tree trunk seemed to watch us with malevolent intent. The woods felt alive, but not in a good way. Alive with something ancient and hungry. We followed the trail we'd taken the day before, back towards the visitor center, or at least we hoped it was the right way. In the fog, everything looked different, distorted and menacing. The towering redwoods loomed like silent giants, their upper reaches lost in the swirling mist. The silence was back, that heavy, oppressive silence, but now it was laced with a new element, a sense of anticipation, of something lurking just beyond the fog, waiting for us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see what? I didn't even know. A shadowy figure. Burning red eyes. Just the thought made my skin crawl. We walked for what felt like hours, the fog clinging to us, the silence pressing in. The trail seemed to twist and turn, leading us deeper and deeper into the woods, instead of out. Panic started to gnaw at the edges of my resolve. Were we lost? Were we going in circles? Or was it leading us somewhere? Somewhere it wanted us to go. Suddenly, Ben stopped dead in his tracks, grabbing my arm, his grip like a vise. Alex, he whispered, his voice trembling. Did you hear that? I froze, listening. At first, there was nothing but the muffled sound of our own breathing, the faint rustle of the fog against the leaves. Then, I heard it. A sound so faint, so distant that I almost dismissed it as my imagination, but it was there. A sigh. A mournful, drawn-out sigh, carried on the fog-laden air. It was far away, but there was no mistaking it. The sighing from the cabin. It had followed us. Or maybe it had been waiting for us. "It's here," I whispered back, my blood turning to ice. "It's still here." The sighing grew louder, closer, as if it was moving towards us through the fog, drawn by our fear, by our desperation. The whispered words started again, carried on the mournful sound, clearer now, no longer just at the edge of comprehension. This time, I could almost make them out. Almost. "Alex," the voice sighed, a mournful, pleading whisper that seemed to claw at my soul. "Alex, come closer." My breath hitched in my throat. It was calling my name. Just like in the cabin. Just like in my nightmares. It knew my name. How could it know my name? "Don't listen to it," I hissed to Ben, grabbing his arm, pulling him forward. "We have to run. Now." We broke into a run, crashing through the fog, the trail disappearing beneath our feet. The sighing followed, growing louder, closer, the whispered words becoming clearer, more insistent, more terrifying. "Alex, Ben, come homie." Home. This wasn't home. This was hell. And it was calling us back. We ran blindly, desperately, through the fogged woods, branches whipping our faces, roots tripping our feet. The sighing was right behind us now, the whispered words almost understandable, a cruel mockery of human speech. Then the fog began to thin, breaking apart in patches, revealing glimpses of the trees around us, and that's when I saw it. Through a gap in the fog, just ahead on the trail, a figure standing motionless, blocking our path. Tall and gaunt, wreathed in shadow, it was barely visible through the swirling mist, but there was no mistaking its presence. It was there, waiting. And as the fog thinned further, revealing more of its form, I saw the eyes. 2 points of burning red light glowing in the gloom, fixed on us with an ancient malevolent hunger. The sighing stopped. The whispered words ceased. In their place, a new sound emerged. A low, guttural growl, deep and resonant, that vibrated through the very ground beneath our feet. A sound that spoke of pure, unadulterated evil. We stopped running, frozen in terror, staring at the figure in the fog, the burning red eyes fixed on us. The growl deepened, echoing through the silent woods, and the figure began to move, slowly, deliberately, stepping out of the fog towards us. That's when I knew. We weren't going to escape. This was it. The end of the trail. And the redwood forest, in its ancient silent wisdom, was going to claim us as its own, just like it had claimed whatever else had dared to wander too deep into its shadowed heart. I closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable. The growl was deafening now. Right in front of us, the burning red eyes searing into my soul. I waited for the darkness to consume me, but it never came. Instead, there was silence. A sudden, absolute silence. Deeper than any silence I had ever known. I cautiously opened my eyes. The fog was gone. The woods were bathed in the soft, golden light of the rising sun. The trail stretched out before us, empty and peaceful. The figure was gone, the red eyes extinguished, the growl silenced. Just the trees, the towering, silent redwoods reaching for the sky, and the heavy, oppressive silence of the forest, now imbued with a new, chilling layer of meaning. Ben and I stood there for a long moment, breathing heavily, our hearts still pounding in our chests, staring at the empty trail ahead. Then slowly, hesitantly, we started walking again. We didn't run. We didn't speak. We just walked, putting one foot in front of the other, moving towards the sunlight, away from the shadows, away from the sighing, away from the red eyes in the fog. We walked until we reached the visitor center, blinking in the sudden brightness, the sounds of human activity washing over us like a balm. We walked until we were out of the park, back in the rental car, driving away from the redwoods, leaving the ancient forest and its secrets behind. We never spoke about what happened in the woods. Not really. We tried to forget. To bury the terror, the sighing, the red eyes, deep down inside ourselves. But some things, once seen, once heard, can never be truly forgotten. Sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and the shadows are long, I hear it. A faint sighing, carried on the wind, and I see them again, those burning red eyes glowing in the fog, watching, waiting. And I know with a chilling certainty that whatever it was, whatever we encountered in the redwood forest, it's still out there, still sighing, still waiting. And maybe, just maybe, it's still calling my name. And one day, I might just be foolish enough to answer.